It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster, where Rishi Sunak is preparing to deliver his autumn budget and spending review. Joining me for this Politics Live budget special, business editor Simon Jack, political editor Laura Kuenssberg and economics editor Faisal Islam. The Chancellor will say the country can move on from the pandemic to an economy for a new age of optimism. Can his speech deliver on that promise against a backdrop of supply problems, rising energy bills and pressure on household finances?
Unfortunately, sometimes what the government gives with one hand, it takes away far more with another.
We'll have all the analysis and we'll be speaking to a Treasury Minister and Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves.
I'm here in Bristol talking to small business owners and asking them what they would like to see coming out of this afternoon's budget announcements.
And before the Chancellor gets to his feet, we'll hear from Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions. Welcome to you all to this BBC Politics Live budget special. Let's show you the scene live in Westminster, those glorious helicopter shots of the Palace of Westminster and the River Thames, because it's a big day here. A big day because Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, will not only be delivering his budget, he will also be delivering his spending review. That will be the 3-year departmental spending. So there will be lots of facts and figures, which is why I'm so delighted to be joined by the BBC's team of experts to talk us through. Rishi Sunak has left number 11 Downing Street. He's taken his red box and his speech. He'll be making his way to the Commons. That's, of course, because we have Prime Minister's Questions, as we mentioned there in the headlines. In fact, here he is coming out of that door with the red box. That was about half an hour ago, for the traditional family photo with his Treasury team. Now, those of you who are keen-eyed might notice that the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Simon Clarke, isn't there. You have to have a big shot there for that team. There he's showing the box. Now, the reason Simon Clarke isn't there, he's tweeted it himself, he's going to be joining us here later on the programme, is that he lives with agoraphobia and so decided not to take part. But as I say, we'll be talking to him, we'll be grilling him about the contents of the speech in that red box. And there is Rishi Sunak off to make his way to the Commons. The government will want to obviously mark a different stage, not through the pandemic. The virus is still with us, but perhaps not in the stage of emergency. And there have been words overnight from the Treasury, as well as a lot of pre-announcements told off by the Speaker of the House, of course, Lindsay Hoyle, about an age of optimism. Let's have a look at one of the newspapers here. The Daily Express, Rishi, new age of optimism. Now Britain needs you to deliver. Laura, can he move on, Rishi Sunak? Can he deliver this optimism, that rather strange phrase, an economy fit for a new age of optimism, a mouthful of rhetoric he'll be judged on?
Well, it is a mouthful of rhetoric, isn't it? It's a sort of budget buzzword bingo. I mean, which Chancellor doesn't stand up and say, look, I want people to feel good about the future. Here are all the incredible things that I'm doing with your money, and everybody can feel comfortable that I really, really am in charge. I think two things to bear in mind. Number one, the country and the economy has just been absolutely hammered during a real, genuine national emergency. But inside government, there's a feeling that actually the economic sort of Armageddon hasn't turned out to be as bad as they feared it might be. And we'll talk about that a lot over the next couple of hours. But of course, that changes the politics. So while Rishi Sunak does want people to believe that he is, in his bones, a careful Conservative who's not going to be splashing the cash around, he also wants people to believe that this government is actually willing to spend money on things that the public think matter to them. And we are in an era, even beyond the acute emergency of the pandemic, of actually a big spending, quite high taxing Conservative government. And I think this new age of optimism is about moving on from the emergency and saying, look, this is what the economy is going to be like. But there are huge huge challenges
Right,
about translating that into real life.
And before we pick up on that with you, Faisal, there's also the backdrop, of course, of a cost of living concerns that people are having. We've seen soaring energy bills, rising petrol prices and fears of inflation.
Yeah, so think of some of the warm-up announcements, bigger national living wage, you know, pay rises coming for public sector workers, except that could quite easily all be eaten up by inflation. You know, what actually ends up feeling in your pocket is not the same as what chancellors can talk about in big statements at the dispatch box.
And this tension that Laura has outlined, if you like, the era of big spending because of the COVID pandemic, we had a sort of taste, a foretaste, if you like, of 20 billion or so pledges to spend even more. It's not a complete picture, of course, and that is what we're going to hear from. Do you think they'll be able to give up on that era of big spending?
When you look at the pre-announcements, they've been designed to sound as big as possible. They've been stretched over a period of years. It's mainly capital spending, so that's long-term investment spending on things like NHS equipment, much needed to deal with the huge waiting lists. But that's long-term spending. It doesn't necessarily count against the key borrowing targets, for example. But actually, even at 20 billion, which is a lot of money, when you consider a spending review, you know, even day-to-day spending is like 450 billion a year. You know, it's not. You stretch that over a per-year basis, it's not quite as big as it sounds. And if you read between the lines there, I think it's going to be quite a tight series of spending decisions that they've made, and that's because, as you say, I mean, maybe trying to decipher this new age rhetoric, it is sort of moving on from 2 years nearly now of emergency rescue Rishi, if you like, to re-establish himself as the Chancellor he would have, you know, wanted to be from the beginning, which is fiscally conservative, sound public finances, and then letting the private sector invest in this new era of high skills, high productivity, high wages. Issue is, every single Chancellor has said over the past 20 years and long before that that's what they want to achieve with a skills revolution, and it's proved devilishly difficult for the United Kingdom. Well,
since you've been mentioning some of the announcements that have been made, let's just show our viewers and give a summary of some of those. The first one, of course, the really big one that was already announced a while ago, national insurance rise of 1.25% to fund social care and NHS recovery. That was very controversial at the time. The £5.9 billion to tackle NHS England backlog. Now, that is very much the capital spending that Faisal was talking about. It will go on buildings and kit in the main. There have been queries about staff shortages in order to deliver that. £6.9 billion for England's transport network. Again, a pretty significant amount, but as we understand it, I think it's £1.5 billion is actually new money, and this will be for transport networks in cities outside London. The wage increases that Laura talked about, the national living wage to rise to £9.50 an hour. That's for workers over 23. There's also an increase in the national minimum wage for those younger than that. And, of course, perhaps the most recent announcement in the long string of pre-announcement, freeze on public sector pay to end. Again, we don't know the details of that. And, of course, inflation, as Laura was mentioning, may eat into some of that. What's left, do you think, Simon? But from a business perspective, what would they like to see?
Business feels pretty bruised over the last couple of years. You had perhaps the low point when that 4-letter dismissal of business fears from Boris Johnson. And that was words, but they matter because of confidence and tone.
Signal.
But then we got the sticks and stones, which were the massive rise in corporation tax, which takes effect in 2023, at a stroke reversing 10 years of Conservative Party tax policy towards business. You then had the rise in employers' national insurance. You've got rising wages, the national living wage, laudable, but that is a cost to small businesses. They feel that they've been a bit of a punch bag for that. Plus, they feel they've been blamed for every shortage under the sun, whether it's HGV drivers, whether it's fuel, whether it's labour shortages. They've been underinvesting. Now, the Treasury will say, hang on a minute, there's a small matter. We paid the wages of 11 million people for the best part of 18 months. Plus, we have got a tax system system which is rewarding businesses that want to invest, the so-called super deduction. Every pound you invest, you get £1.30 back in tax relief. But the problem is that comes to an end in 2023 at exactly the same time as the corporation tax goes up, a real guillotine moment for business. But what they will hope is no more taxes, please, and can you have a more constructive tone, because that relationship has been strained over the last couple of years.
Right, and it does lean into this whole idea of Boris Johnson's of a high-wage, highly skilled economy and the risks that are associated with that, particularly if people's wages or extra money, if they're getting it, are going to be eaten up by things like higher prices. Are you expecting anything else? Because of all these pre-announcements, we talk about the traditional rabbit being pulled out of the hat.
I think there will be something, Joe, because there always is. I mean, no Chancellor can resist the temptation to have something to flourish at the end and get their troops behind them cheering. What we do expect is that the government is going to make some tweaks to universal credit. That benefit is paid to people who are in work and people who don't get paid very much, and also to people who are out of work. Our viewers, I'm sure, will remember week after week us talking about the government taking away the £20 extra a week that was brought in during the pandemic. I'd be amazed if that comes back, but I think the government is going to make it possible for people who get that benefit to keep more of their wages by tweaking the so-called taper, to use the technical bit. There might also be, I expect, a bit of extra help to help people cope with rising energy prices, maybe an increase on what's known as the Warm Homes scheme, so where people who are finding it hard to make ends meet get a bit of extra cash to help with energy bills. But the overall clash here is what is the reality between someone who's seeing their energy bills going up, someone who might have had a pay rise but their weekly shop has gone up by £20. Where's the tension between that and Rishi Sunak telling people to be optimistic about the wonderful future ahead?
Right, well, that is a good point, to go to Bristol and find out what people there are thinking and what they'd like to hear from the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, in the vein of higher prices and perhaps also the view from small businesses. The BBC's Andrew Plant is there. Andrew.
Fiona, lots of headlines already here in Bristol about some of the things we've already heard about, particularly that investment in regional public transport, because there are real problems with some of the network on buses here in Bristol. For example, between Bristol and Bath, it's only about 10 miles. Hundreds of people make that journey every single day, but it can take well over an hour if you're travelling by bus, not much quicker sometimes if you're travelling by car. But I have to say, from talking to small businesses here over the past couple of days, it is still all about the recovery from the pandemic. They say that recovery has only just started. They want a lot more help with that. They say it is still casting a very long shadow. Now, we've got a couple of guests with us here this morning. First up is Lucy from the Royal College of Nursing. Lucy, we've heard about a big investment in the NHS. Is that welcome, and what would you like to see coming from the Chancellor today?
Yeah, so we're asking for 12.5% for our members. We want them to be recognised for the work that they do and their expertise. The other thing we'd like to see today from the Chancellor is a clear strategy on the workforce, as well as a clear steer on the nursing education where it's fully funded.
And we've heard about the unfreezing of public sector pay, and also how some of that money will go to things like scanning centres, perhaps in shopping centres. Is that welcome? Will it help?
Well, it's a good thing to know that there's going to be clinics out there, there's going to be other buildings, but what the nursing staff are asking for is extra staff. The staffing shortage in this country is immense. Staff are overwhelmed, they're exhausted, and what we want to see is more staff at the places of work. OK, Lucy, thank you very much indeed. We've also got Liana here with us. Liana, you run a small business in Bristol, don't you? Yeah. You were also a musician before the pandemic hit, so your business stopped there. What would you like to see today?
So today, I think I just want to see help for more working class people. I don't think it's going to happen. They need to tax the big corporations. They've got to stop taxing the working class people. I work pretty much 7 days a week, and it's like I'm still struggling to get by, and I feel that we just need to move forward with how we do things, but unfortunately that's probably not going to happen. And I know, Liana, you've been on universal credit, we were talking about it earlier. Yeah. What would you like to see happen with that, and how would it affect you to lose that £20? So it does affect me, but it just means that I'm going to be working harder. It's like, but how can I work more than 7 days a week when I'm already working between doing music, doing freelance teaching, and I run my own business? And it's like, during the pandemic, I employed other people who lost their work. My ethos was to employ other musicians and to help them. So it's like, well, how am I working more to get that little bit of extra money to help me and my family? Liana, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and we will hear
what the Chancellor has to say very shortly, about 12:30 this afternoon. Back to you.
Thank you very much there, Andrew, in Bristol, with some of the concerns of local people there. I'm just going to draw your attention to some graphs we're going to show you about the economic backdrop to today's budget, because, as the team here was saying, they were expecting slightly better figures. But let's have a look at government borrowing as a percentage of GDP. You can see the financial crash in 2008, the high point then. It's been decreasing. But then look at what happens on this next graph when COVID hits. It shoots up to 14.5%. Now, that's the highest since 1946, when borrowing was at 15.2%. That was part of Clement Attlee, the Labour Prime Minister's measures to help the nation recover from the Second World War. Now, here is something that you're likely to hear the government talking about today, and this is about growth forecasts. The UK in relation to G7 countries, and there is the UK on 6.8%. They're the IMF figures from this month, slightly above France on 6.3% and comfortably ahead of the Eurozone average at 5%. But Faisal, that is not the complete picture, is it?
Well, you can see why a politician would cling on to that particular chart, but I do vividly remember interviewing the Chancellor when we had the previous year's figures, and he said they weren't even comparable. So, you know, suddenly they are comparable when we're top of the list. The truth is that is partly a kind of trampoline-like bounce back from the fact we had the worst figures the year before. However, it's clearly welcome that it's happened. It's clearly welcome that we have bounced back. But I think there's a difference between a rebound and a kind of sustained recovery. And it's really quite interesting that a fundamental judgment contained within these budget numbers from the Chancellor is that the recovery has had the support from tax and spend policy that it needs. That, if you like to use a bad analogy, it doesn't need a booster jab right now. But at the same time, unexpected from 6 months ago. So we'll get better borrowing forecasts, we will get better growth forecasts, unemployment. You know, I have to say, the fact that they will forecast it to not even peak above 5.5% potentially, you know, we would have seen that as a miracle, given where the forecasts were 2 years ago. But that borrowing forecast will come down. And indeed, it could come down below 2 or 3%, which means on a current basis, that's stripping out investment spending, he could end up having a surplus. So he will end up he will bring forward, I think, new rules to restrain his borrowing going forward. We've had a load of these things over the past 10 or 20 years.
Yes.
They're supposed to signal credibility to the country, to the market.
Are they really meaningful, these new... I mean, just to explain these new financial rules, chancellors love them. They love to announce them. Do they sort of say the same kind of thing when they bring them in?
Basically, it allows you to spend money on equipment and infrastructure that have a return over 5, 10, 15 years. So a hospital, a road, equipment, but not salaries and staff, OK? That's essentially the difference. It's a bit more complicated than that. Now, I think actually one of the patterns we're going to see today is that a lot of the spending will be pushed into capital, but the current spending will be kept quite restricted. So you will get the phenomenon, potentially, of the equipment being there to deal with the waiting lists, for example. But what about the staff? What about the pay? What about the number of operators of these MRI scanners? Look for that pattern across a lot of spending, because it's easier, I think, with the rules we're going to get. We haven't got them, by the way. It's easier to do that than not. But you're right, they've been broken routinely. And I think for the Chancellor, this is about him setting his fiscal credibility. He came into office at number 11, spent hundreds of billions, understandably, on an emergency, and now this is his chance to say, this is the Chancellor I am, both to the country but also to the market.
Right. Now, that's interesting, because we have had several months, I'd say, of reports of fractious relationships, or relations, I should say, between number 10 and number 11. Boris Johnson, big spender, wants to do the big infrastructure thing that Faisal has just been talking about, and... just as you've said, Faisal, number 11, Rishi Sunak, wanting to try, at least, and show that he is still what we call a fiscal conservative. Have they ironed out those differences?
I think the mood music between the next-door neighbours is slightly better than it was a few months ago. It certainly has been a bit of a bumpy time, because there's an ideological clash there, you know. Boris Johnson likes big projects. He likes big spending. He likes to be able to announce things that sound sort of enthusiastic and bold and big. Rishi Sunak is by nature a fiscal hawk, to use that sort of political metaphor. He is somebody in the Tory tradition of being very, very careful with money and very, very much a believer in the principle of sound money, that basically you can't spend if you haven't got the cash. Now, this is where, as Faisal was saying, borrowing can come in for long-term priorities, whether that's infrastructure or other things. It's OK to have a big, giant mortgage in order to do big, important things. What's not OK instinctively for someone like Rishi Sunak is to be borrowing loads of money for the kinds of things that the government has to do every single day. And that's why the fiscal rules are making a comeback. They didn't just sort of disappear off into the ether. But from a political point of view, I think he's really got no choice but to reintroduce them, not just because Labour has actually introduced their own fiscal rules, but also because in the Conservative Party there is unease, there is concern about how this government is wanting to sort of squat in the middle of the political road, tax big and spend big. And for a lot of Conservatives, that's not very comfortable, especially when it's accompanied by some of that quite anti-business rhetoric that Simon was talking about.
Well, and just to return to that, this high-wage, highly skilled economy, obviously, again, directed to some extent at business. What has been the response to the announcements of the pay freeze being lifted on public sector workers, rising wages in the private sector?
I think the rising wages thing is really interesting because you heard Boris Johnson at the Tory party conference saying higher wages equals jolly good thing, hooray. In economics, you'll be told that what you do is you get your productivity in first and then you get your higher wages, not the other way round. And some people, say there's slightly economically illiterate to think just by increasing wages you get a more productive economy. I think what businesses' concern is that we were trying to be the best place to start and grow a business. They talk about the headline corporation tax rate, still lower than in Europe, but you add business rates, you add corporation tax, you add all of those things together, national insurance, and actually we go from near the top of the competitive league to near the bottom of the competitive league. So at the moment, people on the Conservative side will say this isn't the low tax, low spending Conservative Party that we know and love. In fact, what we've ended up is a high tax, high spend, and actually on a competitive basis, when you're up against the rest of the world, the UK is looking less competitive now than it was before.
All right, well, let's test the temperature with two very influential backbenchers from the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. Steve Baker, Conservative MP, and former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. Welcome to both of you. I hope you were able to hear the discussion we've just been having. Steve, Laura talking about some unease and concern in Tory circles. Your colleague, David Davis, questioned whether Rishi Sunak really is a Thatcherite at the weekend. Is that something that worries you too?
Well, yes, of course it is, and I've called for the Conservative Party to rediscover its belief in free markets. And actually, I do have great faith in Rishi Sunak, that is where his heart and soul is. He wants to be a free market Conservative, relying on the private sector and private sector investment to create more productive jobs. And I think that's what he'll seek to deliver. And by delivering it, help families with the cost of living, generate the revenue we need for world-class public services. And as some of your panel have said already, this is what chancellors always say they want to do. Right. I think the really big difference with Rishi is he really does understand business and markets, and I've got great faith he'll deliver today.
Yes, obviously that's newly found faith, may I say, Steve, because actually earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, you called current government spending socialism. Is that how you see it at the moment?
Of course, yeah. I mean, through the pandemic, there's been a massive advance in the use of state power and spending, absolutely vast borrowing, but that has been to build a bridge through the pandemic. So whatever unease I may have felt, I've been aware of my duty to my constituents who've needed, for example, the furlough scheme. But, Rishi's had to respond to really historic circumstances. It looks at the moment with the rebound on the growth that he's done that successfully. Well, now we've got to turn that rebound into a sustained recovery and prosperity. One of the biggest burdens on any individual, on any family, is, of course, the cost of the state. And I think Rishi knows that. So right. I am expecting him to start doing the things that I know he believes in. And that is to get the public finances under control, to help people with the cost of living, and so on.
We'll have to ask you what you think those look like in just a moment. But let's talk to a proud socialist. John McDonnell, you must be delighted then with Steve Baker describing the current government as socialist, something you could sign up to.
I quite enjoy watching a few Thatcherites fall out amongst themselves to see who's the most purist ideologically. But let's be clear that what people are interested in this budget is the point that you've raised in this discussion, cost of living. And when they see what they're facing in terms of energy price rises, inflation rising, and they look at what's on offer, then I think they'll certainly see that Rishi Sunak is no socialist. No socialist would cut universal credit to the poorest within our society. And they wouldn't impose a pay freeze and then do a sort of a stunt about abolishing the pay freeze, but not guaranteeing that any pay rise will even match inflation. And then also for the NHS staff and social care workers, offering them 3% when you know inflation is more than likely to is already 3.1% and most probably reaching 4%. So he's certainly no socialist. And I think this theme he's developing today about age of optimism, well, I think people are going to be pretty disappointed in these coming months when they face up to the realities of the cost of living crisis that they're facing.
Right. Steve, what do you say in response? It's going to be more pessimistic than optimistic.
Well, of course, the Conservative Party's always been a pragmatic party. There's a spectrum of opinion in our party. And, of course, we take the reins of power and we govern according to the circumstances we face. And that's what we've seen Rishi do over the preceding years. But, you know, throughout the course of human history, it's never been socialism that's promoted prosperity. Every time it's been seriously tried, it's always led to poverty, to misery, to ruin on a mass scale. I mean, Venezuela, of course, is a paradigmatic example. And that's why pragmatic Conservatives like me want a return to free market principles, which have actually served our country very well over a long period. So, you know, Rishi knows that. I think we've had a problem during the pandemic that we've been very clear what we'd like to do and then done something else because circumstances have forced it upon us. I think this is a pivot moment for the government. They've got to decide, are we going to do the things we know to be right? And that includes facilitating private sector investment and helping families with the cost of living by making work pay. So, for example, I called on them to find $10 billion a year to improve universal credit through the work allowance and the taper rate and the £20. I really hope they do something serious on universal credit because I, like everybody else, want us to have a really effective safety net that we can be proud of.
Right.
But the point is it's a safety net that should be catapulting people into productive jobs in the private sector.
Would you like to see tax cuts?
I'd always like to see tax cuts.
In this budget?
Well, of course, in any budget, I'd like to see tax simplification and tax cuts. I've signed up to saying there should be tax cuts on beer duty. You know, some areas of our lives are already excruciatingly taxed. You know, we go to the petrol pumps mostly to pay tax. We pay too much tax on booze and other areas of so-called sin taxes. You know, these are really excruciating costs on families. You know, there's about 10 billion plus of subsidy going to renewables through our energy bills. I'd like to see that actually moved on to general taxation in order to get bills down and make clear what is going on with the cost of net zero.
Right.
So there's a lot that he can do today.
All right, I'm just going to interrupt. We were just showing pictures there of Boris Johnson. He's left number 10 Downing Street, heading to the Commons for Prime Minister's questions in just over 15 minutes' time. I'm going to open it up to all the editors in just a moment. But before I do, John McDonnell, listening there, you agree broadly on universal credit. You heard there, John, what Steve was saying. But if Boris Johnson wants to turn the UK into a high-wage, highly skilled economy for the future, doesn't that sound a lot like Corbynism?
Interesting is the phrase that we were using throughout. By the way, just on Steve's reference to socialist governments, let's talk about the Attlee government and the creation of the NHS that this government is currently seeking to privatise, and yet in the face of even Conservative opposition in some of the Conservative associations. Anyway, yes, you need to invest. You need to invest in the long term, and you need to ensure that you've got the skills in place. But the problem, I say again, is that I've listened to the various announcements, pre-budget announcements that have been made. To be frank, they're nothing on the scale that's needed after we've had a decade of savage austerity. You take local authorities. I'm hoping he's going to say something about local councils today and funding, because they've lost cumulatively over the last 11 years, they've lost 100 billion in central government funding. That impacts upon the whole range of local public services. And you mentioned the NHS funding, this additional capital equipment money. That, you know, there's a £9 billion backlog because of cuts over the last 11 years. And exactly as one of the people you interviewed said, where are the staff to operate these new machines, the new scanners that are coming in? There's 100,000 vacancies. Part of that vacancy problem is recruitment and retention, because wages have been frozen effectively for about 10 years. What we need is a government that really does look at a long-term plan for the economy, invests in both people's skills and also in the capital infrastructure that we need. We haven't had that for 11 years, and from what I've seen so far on the announcements, it's nothing on this scale that's needed. In fact, it's trivial in comparison with the cuts that have been made.
All right, Laura.
Joe, we've just heard out of Cabinet that the Prime Minister made clear the priorities of the budget are strong public services, infrastructure, innovation and skills, and support for working families. Now, we'll have to see what that means in practice. I can hear John saying that all rhetoric. Of course, it's all rhetoric. Let's see what actually happens at the dispatch box. But on that support for working families, Steve Baker, you mentioned there you have been one of the senior Conservatives calling for more action on universal credit to try to enable people to keep more of the cash that they actually earn. I've heard on the grapevine the Chancellor has briefed some senior Tory MPs this morning about what he's going to say. We understand they will be trying to make that happen and tweaking the taper rate. But what have you heard on that? Are you confident that he is going to allow people to keep more of their earnings?
Well, I know what I've said to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, which is you need to find £10 billion a year for a universal credit system we can really be proud of. And I've said the same to welfare ministers. And I know that welfare ministers have responded that actually it's down to the Treasury. So I think it is all eyes on the Chancellor today. I can't pre-announce what he might do because I haven't been told. But I think when I made the point to all of them that when we came to power in 2010, the Centre for Social Justice's agenda, and they of course invented universal credit, their agenda was at the heart of what we wanted to do. Because I think we all understand that it's Conservative ideas which are best for working people. An old carpenter of my close acquaintance once said to me that the worst kind of government for a working man is a Labour government. And that's because, as John has demonstrated, Labour governments never really give a thought to where the money is coming from, or rather they always suggest it's going to come from someone else.
And Stephen, you and John can trade blows on that until the clock reaches midnight. But on the specifics around universal credit, to be clear to the audience, we're not expecting anything like the 10 billion that you're suggesting to go into that system. No, if all it is a tweak to the taper rate, which makes a difference to, I think, about fewer than half the people who claim that benefit, would you still want the Chancellor then to go back and look again?
Well, it depends exactly what the numbers are, but I have to be realistic. I'm a fiscal Conservative. I have to be realistic that even a relatively small tweak to the taper rate is extremely expensive to the Exchequer, and that means to taxpayers.
All right.
So, whatever he decides on this, I've made it very clear throughout, I will have to vote for it. But I want to see Wickham become a place that is more prosperous, happier and freer. That's what I'm in politics to deliver. And that means an investment in the private sector to deliver more productive work. It also, by the way, means the 5.9 billion into the NHS so that we can, for example, deliver more agile digital projects, which will make the NHS more productive, help people get the appointments they need. And actually, we should see a virtuous cycle. So I'm quite optimistic that they could deliver today.
All right.
But it requires us to really embrace what's possible.
Faisal.
Faisal Islam, Economics Editor here. I was very interested in your concept of this being a pivot budget for the Chancellor, from emergency Rishi to kind of more steady state, normal service resumed. I just wonder if there is a chance that, having spent all this money, this extraordinary intervention that nobody would have predicted in advance on the furlough scheme, the public has changed. The public now kind of expects a kind of helping hand, whereas before they might not have. I mean, I'm very struck that when we go around the country, on the cost of living issue, on the prices issue, people are expecting the budget to help solve prices that I think maybe a few years back they'd have said, well, that's down to the supermarkets, it's down to markets, but they want the government to solve that. In like Interview and Vox Pop, again and again and again, they're saying that. So has something maybe changed in the political economy of Britain after this extraordinary emergency intervention that maybe you don't like?
Well, I have to say I hope that something has not changed in the way that you articulate, because if it has, we're going to be in terrible trouble. The idea of a prices and incomes policy, for example, trying to actually control the price of goods and services and what people are paid right across the economy, that would be a real disaster for us all. The only way to coordinate what we produce in our lives is prices, profit and loss. I mean, that is why socialism never works.
All right.
And we're doing at the moment, for example, the energy market is a disaster because of government intervention. We're not in a crisis of laissez-faire. We're in a crisis of mass state intervention, very high taxes, huge deficit spending, massive borrowing and crassly easy money.
All right.
None of these things are liberalism or conservatism.
Let me let John respond to this issue, though, that Faisal has raised, an important one, which has the mood in the public changed? Has the mind sort of moved towards a more statist style of government and economy?
I think Faisal's hit something. I think there has been a paradigm change. I've been talking about it for the last 6 months in a recent project I undertook called Claim the Future. And it is a paradigm change where throughout the COVID crisis we were reminded, first of all, that we need each other, but secondly, that we care for each other, and that we were reminded that the way in which we come together collectively is often via the state, nationally, but more importantly, I think, locally as well, and that in addition to that, there is that need for community action. And I think the communities come together with a complete paradigm shift, and they want a different set of values, moving away from this hard right neoliberalism into a society that we construct which is based upon fairness. That means fair taxation, is based upon the community deciding in the long term what it needs in terms of investment, so very much about devolution of decision-making and powers, and ensuring that actually we recognise crises that are coming at us. And the next big crisis, the existential crisis, is climate change. So I think the pandemic actually has taught us a lot, and I think there is definitely a paradigm change within people's thinking individually, but also, I think, communally as well. And that's why this budget really is so out of step with, I think, what people want. They don't want to live in a society where there are children in poverty who are hungry this winter, where people are having to choose between heating or eating, where people are isolated without the social care they need. I think there's a huge demand now for that creation of that sort of society that we need, where we do recognise we need each other, but we care for each other as well.
All right, two competing visions there.
Well, no, it's not competing. I agree we should care with each other.
Well, yes, all right.
But it must be
Apart from that bit, all right, Steve, all right.
I think what's interesting...
Voluntarism, that's what we need.
What is interesting about the debate we're having between Steve and John there is that this idea of statism, which we've kind of got used to, is the point that Faisal was making, and that, it's going to take some time for that to wear off, if ever it does. And also Steve saying we've got to bring in the private sector. Well, what business is saying, you're asking us to do an awful lot. You're asking us to pay for a transition to net zero. You're asking us to upskill the economy. You're asking us to spend a lot of money. And at the same time, you're raising taxes, you're raising national insurance contributions, you're sending very mixed messages. And by the way, also slightly blaming business for a shortage of HGV drivers and sometimes treating businesses for their sort of underinvesting, self-pitying moaners. And that's why I think the business feel a bit bruised. And so, yeah, the private sector want to get involved, but they feel that the tax policy and the general tone towards them are very, very mixed messages. 1 minute, they're moaning. The next minute, saying, we love you, please help us to get to net zero. And that's the kind of... That's the kind of tussle that's going on at the moment.
All right, well, we'll pick up on that in just a moment. But, Steve, net zero, the climate change conference, I should say, coming up soon. John mentioned it, of course, as the next existential crisis that has to be tackled. Are you expecting to hear Rishi Sunak put a price tag on how much costs to deliver net zero will be?
Well, I don't expect he'll be able to do that today because so far there's been a real unwillingness to really put costs around it. I was encouraged that an 18 billion price tag seems to have been put on Plan B on COVID restrictions, so perhaps we're seeing a return to the Treasury doing the kind of cost-benefit analysis it should do around serious government policies. But one of the things I would say about net zero is remember that this target of going to net zero was nodded through the House of Commons. I was there on a statutory instrument. And that's why next week I'm going to be with the Hansard Society launching a project to look at just how we are controlling power, because it turns out that vast costs like the cost of net zero have been imposed on the public by delegated legislation. In other words, ministers signed an instrument and then it was nodded through with really no scrutiny. And actually that's going to really now bite. And crucially, it's going to bite with all the major political parties in consensus on it. So the public have never really been given a choice. That's why I think it's so interesting that the idea of a referendum has emerged. And of course, crucially, that any referendum on net zero, unlike the Brexit referendum, will have a concrete plan to vote on.
I'm sorry I'm hurrying you along because we haven't got long until Prime Minister's questions. Just before I let you go, you mentioned this idea of a referendum on the government plans to net zero. Just yes or no. Is that a good idea, John?
I think we need to get on with the job now. We haven't got time for a referendum. We're facing an existential threat. Has Steve not seen the fires in California, the flooding in Germany, in the global south? We need to get on with the job, get COP agreement, get the investment that we need and mobilise our whole economy, our whole community. We can't wait for referendums This is a threat to our very existence. Our children and grandchildren will never forgive us if we delay this matter any further.
All right. Thank you to both of you. I presume it's a yes on a referendum from you, Steve.
Well, I thought that I'd never want another referendum again, but when I see the consensus,
it's funny how memories.
Yeah, when I see all political parties, in a sense, conspiring together to do it without giving the public a choice, I think maybe we do need a referendum.
Don't even start. Thank you very much to Steve Baker and John McDonnell. We'll let you go off to Prime Minister's questions and, of course, to hear the statement. I think we can once again remind you, of course, of the big day, the scene here in Westminster. There it is, the Palace of Westminster. Will be gearing up. The chamber will be filling up. I'm sure it'll be pretty packed today because we have 5 minutes until Prime Minister's questions, which will be seen. Oh, there is the chamber, and it is indeed filling up there with MPs on all sides. It will be seen. It was this strange juxtaposition of Prime Minister's questions, which is the big weekly event, the clash between the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition, but coming ahead of perhaps the even bigger event, which of course is the budget and the spending review. Now, I mentioned the spending review because we haven't really had much time to talk about it, and this is about the government's plans for departments. We can show you here, I think, some graphs. We can see plan changes in day-to-day spending. That's current spending. We can see the new Labour years under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Consistently, relatively healthy increases in day-to-day spending. Then you have the years of the coalition, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. That, of course, was in the wake of the financial crisis. And look at that, big reductions in spending. As you will remember, of course, it was a policy of austerity at the time that the government argued was necessary. And then this graph here, which is more recent spending reviews that we've seen in the last couple of years. Increased budgets are back. It doesn't include special measures put in place during the pandemic. So we're not talking about a return to austerity. However, it does not mean that there won't be difficult days ahead for individual departments, some of them. Because let me show you this, and this is the planned resource spending, excuse the jargon, but spending on health particularly. Government Department 22-23, 40% going on health and social care. Much bigger chunk of public money than in previous years. And you can see what it means for other departments. Now, there are already commitments on areas like defence, education and overseas aid, but perhaps not that much for other departments. Faisal, they're going to feel the squeeze?
If nothing else is done, they will feel the squeeze. And these are important but smaller areas of public services where there has been pressure and there was ongoing pressure from the austerity years. Courts, prisons, borders, but crucially, especially given the levelling up agenda, local government. And if you don't fund local government enough, it comes out in the wash in terms of council tax rises, business rates pressure. No, I don't think we are expecting business rates, despite the review being published, there to be a movement on that. I'm sure Simon's got more to say on that.
Yes.
That's partly because they can't find the money for local government. So I think a bigger theme here is we're going to get the receipts for a lot of government slogans, levelling up. OK, we've got 3 years' worth of funding numbers. We should be able to see some sort of levelling of spending in regional spend, not just random projects funded. What does it look like across the piece in the Treasury spreadsheet? Likewise, net zero. Likewise, science superpower, which I think Simon's going to take up that issue. It's really important. This is a test. We have a giant spreadsheet of numbers, of plans, of priorities, of decisions that have been made. We can judge some of these slogans.
The Levelling Up Fund, Faisal said, the Community Ownership Fund, the Shared Prosperity Fund, these are pots of money that local government can bid for that is supposed to, I suppose, regenerate the high street, amongst other things. Is that what businesses will be hoping for and local government?
Businesses' longest cherished dream was a massive overhaul of business rates. They've been calling this for ages. We've had countless reviews of this, and they were hoping that this might be the budget. We don't think it is going to be this budget. There might be some tweaks. For example, if you put solar panels on the roof of your factory, at the moment you'll get a bill of higher business rates because you've improved the building. Maybe they'll change that because it's in line with the green agenda. But Faisal's right on the local government thing. For many people, the place where they experience public services is via their local authority, and their budgets have been squeezed enormously. And one of the reasons for not overhauling business rates is that is the major source of funding for local government. So that's one of the reasons why not only is it a £30 billion a year money spinner, some of that money goes directly into local government, and that's where people experience public services. On the science superpower, A lot of people looking out for whether this commitment to spend £22 billion a year in R&D by 24-25 is going to slide a bit. If it does, it slightly undermines this idea of making this kind of scientific superpower, high-knowledge economy, because every pound that comes out of that government R&D spending, that's supposed to crowd in private sector funding. So every pound you lose there, you lose a bit of private sector investment as well.
Promise, wasn't it, rather than Rishi Sunak's, I think?
Okay.
It's one of the things that Boris Johnson loved to talk about,
yes.
you know, almost the sort of, you know, let's send people into outer space, let's build rockets, let's be a science superpower. It's exactly the kind of political present that Boris Johnson likes to serve up. But on that and all sorts of other things, the Levelling Up Fund that Faisal mentioned, the commitments that the government has made over the last couple of years, it will be absolutely vital today to go through the small print. Have they stuck to promises that they've already made? And also, is there a wider coherence in what's being put forward today? You know, something always pops into my head. One of Boris Johnson's team once said to me, I said, what's the real priority now? OK, you're moving past the emergency of the pandemic. What's the real priority? And they said, well, we don't have a priority. That's the great thing. He wants to do everything, was basically their suggestion. Except that to govern is to choose. No government, even with an 80-seat majority, can do everything all of the time. And something like a budget plus a spending review, which gives us a crystal ball into the future, is an unusual opportunity for us to actually look at the facts that the money talks, right? What does it actually add up to? Is it a coherent political project, or are there so many sort of bits and pieces all over the place that actually we're not really any the wiser about what the government wants to do?
And then that graph about the 40% of that sort of planned spending on healthcare, that is clearly still a priority.
And that massively puts the thumb on the scale, basically, for every other bit of government. There's no question about that. Now, from a political point of view, this government and previous governments believed that healthcare is always the public's top priority, and therefore it just has to get the lion's share of the cash. But my goodness, for good or for ill, it skews things everywhere else. And that's why we will see still very tight settlements. In other words, other departments in some places still pretty strapped for cash.
All right, let's...
A decade or so ago, that figure was below 30%. It's now going to be above 40% of day-to-day spending
So it is
on
a big
health.
jump.
So we're sort of, you know, there's that old joke about the British state being a health service attached to, you know, civil service. That's not a very funny joke, I should say.
Sorry, yes, we should have laughed. Was that up to laugh?
But you know, it just taking up a lot of the spending and the attention.
Time to go into the chamber for Prime Minister's questions.
Meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, during which my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, updated the Cabinet on how the government's plan for jobs is working, with higher wages, higher skills and rising productivity. He will make a statement to the House shortly, setting out how we will build a new age of optimism, Mr. Speaker. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the A66 Northern Trans-Pennine project from Penrith to Scotch Corner. This £1 billion investment will improve safety and congestion and help to level up our region, supporting jobs, essential services and tourism. But we have to get the project right. Will my right honourable friend ask his government departments for Transport, the Ministry of Defence and DEFRA to work together pragmatically and reasonably with suggested route amendments to ensure local communities such as Warcock, Musgrave and Sandford are not left blighted by these current plans?
Mr. Speaker, he's right that the development that he refers to is part of an infrastructure revolution I think will transform the country, but he's also right that we should consider local feedback from stakeholders and the community when finalising the design, and so we will.
Unfortunately, the Leader of the Opposition is isolating, so I'm calling Ed Miliband to ask the question on behalf of the Opposition. Ed Miliband.
Thank you. Just like the old day.
Just to say, I presume you all want to get onto the budget, because all you're doing is delaying it. Ed Miliband.
I just want to reassure both sides of the House it's one time only that I'm back. Mr. Speaker, we all need the vital COP26 summit in Glasgow to deliver next week, because failing to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees will have devastating consequences for our planet, and that is shared across this House. Does the Prime Minister agree that to keep that goal of 1.5 degrees alive, we need to roughly halve global emissions in this decisive decade?
Well, I welcome the right honourable gentleman to his place, and indeed, I think the whole House will extend our sympathies to the leader of the opposition. I hope he returns soon. It is, of course, correct, Mr. Speaker, that COP26 is both unbelievably important for our planet, but also very difficult, and it's in the balance. Mr. Speaker, and he's right in what he says about the need to keep 1.5 degrees alive, and that will be, and it does depend on what happens this decade. It depends on the commitments that are made. All I will say, Mr. Speaker, is that already very substantial commitments under the UK presidency designate of COP have been achieved, and we've moved from only 30% of the global economy committed to a net zero by the middle of the century to now 80%. And every day as I talk to international leaders, we hear further commitments to make those solid commitments that the world will need. Whether it is enough, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid it is too early to say.
Mr. Speaker, I applaud the efforts of the UK presidency under the President-designate Sharma, but I do want to direct the Prime Minister's attention to the issue of this decade. I'll come to net zero targets for the middle of the century in a moment, but yesterday a very important report came out from the United Nations, which he will know, the UNEP emissions gap report. And on the eve of COP, it warned that far from halving global emissions this decade, we're only on course to reduce them by about 7.5%. Does the Prime Minister acknowledge, because this is crucial for what happens at Glasgow and after Glasgow, does the Prime Minister acknowledge how far away we are from the action required in this 10-year period?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, indeed I do, but I think what the House should also recognise is how far we have moved just in the space of a few years since the Paris COP summit of 2015, where, as I'm sure the right honourable gentleman will remember, the world agreed to net zero by 2100, by the end of the century, and agreed to try to restrain global warming by 4 degrees. We're now trying to keep alive the prospect of restricting that growth to 1.5 degrees. Every day, Mr. Speaker, countries are coming through with solid commitments on stopping the output of coal-fired power stations, reducing their use on internal combustion engines, planting millions of trees and investing hundreds of billions of pounds in the developing world. Those are solid commitments. Whether they're going to be enough, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid it is still too early to say.
Full commitments. I just correct the Prime Minister on one point. It was the second half of this century set out in Paris, not 2100 for net zero. But here's the problem, Prime Minister, on this question of net zero targets for the middle of the century. It's easy to make promises for 30 years' time. It's much more difficult to act now. Australia has recently announced a 2050 net zero target, but its 2030 target would head the world towards approximately 4 degrees of global warming. Can I urge him? He mustn't shift the goalposts when it comes to Glasgow. It is about the emergency we face this decade. It's about the NDCs this decade. Please keep the focus on 2030, not 2050 and beyond.
The focus is certainly on 2030. We have 122 nationally determined contributions already. 17 out of 20 G20 countries have made NDCs, and the commitments are coming through. And he's right to say that we need to keep the pressure up. What you can't do, Mr. Speaker, is go in advance of what is truly practicable for the world economy and for what people can do. This government will go as fast as we possibly can. But it was Labour's plans, which I think he endorsed, were condemned by the GMB union for which their paymasters, Mr. Speaker, for meaning that they'd be confiscating people's cars by 2030, and families would be only allowed one airplane flight every 5 years, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, let me tell him. What this summit needs is statesmanship, not partisanship, which we just heard from the Prime Minister. He should not be trying to score party political points on such an important issue facing our country and our world. That's never the way I did PMQs. Now let me ask him. Now let me ask him about the crucial issue of climate finance for developing countries, because the reason that the Paris summit succeeded was there was a coalition of vulnerable countries and developed countries that put pressure on all the big emitters, including China, including India. But the problem is that the world has not delivered on the $100 billion of finance promised more than a decade ago in Copenhagen. That the plan is to deliver it maybe in 2023. But I want to ask him about his actions. Hasn't it made it much harder to deliver on this promise that we are the only G7 country to cut the aid budget in the run-up to this crucial summit?
Mrs. Speaker, I thought we weren't going to have any partisan points. Didn't last long. Actually, the first thing I did, one of the first things I did as Prime Minister was to go out to my first UNGA as Prime Minister's UN General Assembly as Prime Minister and announce a huge £11.6 billion commitment from the UK to helping the developed world to tackle climate change. And I'm going to say to the right honourable, yes, of course it's true, and we haven't cut that. We have not cut that, Mr. Speaker. We're keeping that investment. And let me tell the right honourable gentleman that this country is working flat out to ensure that we do reach the £100 billion commitment from the whole of the world. We're seeing the money come in from the United States, from the Italians, from the French, from the European Union, and it's quite right that it should. We have a way to go, Mr. Speaker. Whether we'll get there or not, I cannot say. It's in the balance. But the challenge is there for the leaders of the developed world, and I quite agree with the right honourable gentleman. They need to rise to it.
Because it's one thing for him not to know what is in the Paris Agreement, but it's another for him not to know what's in his own budget. He has cut the aid budget. Of course he's cut the aid budget. He's abandoned the bipartisan belief in the aid budget across both of these houses. But it's not just on aid, Mr. Speaker, where they face both ways. They've got a trade deal with Australia, where they've allowed them to drop their temperature commitments. They're telling others to power past coal while flirting with a new coal mine. And they're saying we've got to move beyond fossil fuels and opening the new Cambo oil field. Isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister has undermined his own COP presidency by saying one thing and doing another?
Prime Minister. No, Mr. Speaker. And he's completely wrong. He's completely wrong in what he's. And I think he should withdraw what he's just said about the 11.6 billion. Because we remain absolutely committed to the 11.6 billion pounds that we're investing to tackle climate change around the world, and that is absolutely rock solid. And he talks about Australia, and I talked to the Prime Minister of Australia only recently, and Australia has just with great difficulty made the commitment to get to net zero by 2050. It's a great thing. And Mr. Speaker, I talked yesterday to our Indonesian friends, for instance, Joko Widodo, a good friend of this country, who's agreed on coal to bring forward the abolition of coal use in Indonesia to 2040, Mr. Speaker. A fantastic effort by the Indonesians. I talked to President Putin, I think it was yesterday, Mr. Speaker, and he confirmed his determination to get to net zero by the middle of the century. And that is what the UK is doing, working with countries around the world to get the outcome we want. It's still too early to say whether it will succeed, Mr. Speaker. It's in the balance.
The thing the Prime Minister has underestimated throughout these last 2 years is COP26 is not a glorified photo opportunity. It is a fragile and complex negotiation. And the problem is boosterism. The Prime Minister's boosterism won't cut carbon emissions in half. Photo opportunities won't cut carbon emissions in half. Can I just say to the Prime Minister, in these final days before COP26, we need more than warm words. Above all, Glasgow has got to be a summit of climate delivery, not climate delay.
Prime Minister! He talks about cutting CO2 in half. Well, that's virtually what this government has done, Mr. Speaker. Since 1990, we've cut CO2 by 44%, and the economy's grown by 78%. And that's our approach, Mr. Speaker, a sensible, pragmatic, conservative approach that cuts CO2, that tackles climate change, and that delivers high-wage, high-skilled jobs across this country. And our net zero plan, Mr. Speaker, will deliver 440,000 jobs. That's what the people of this country want to see, and that's what they're seeing. They're seeing wages up, they're seeing growth up, they're seeing productivity up under this government. And if we left it to the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, who is sadly not in his place, we would still be in lockdown. But it's a point that he might bring to his attention wherever he is currently self-isolated.
Speaker, the Prime Minister will know that both I and my honourable friend, the member for Wolverhampton South West, have lobbied for funding for better training and skills provision for young people in Wolverhampton. Our unemployment rate, youth unemployment, was unacceptably high pre-pandemic and now sadly is the highest rate nationally. Would the Prime Minister urgently look at how the government can level up opportunity so that young people in Wolverhampton can get the skills and the confidence they need to find work?
My honourable friend is absolutely right about Wolverhampton. That's why we're working flat out to ensure that young people in Wolverhampton benefit from the Kickstart scheme, and we are working with Wolverhampton Council to ensure that young people get bespoke support for their return to work.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the thoughts and prayers of the entire House will be with the family of Walter Smith, who sadly passed away yesterday, the legend that was the Rangers, Dundee United and Scotland manager, and many of us will not forget the day that he led us to victory over France at Hampden. Mr. Speaker, naturally, most of today's focus and attention will turn to the Chancellor's budget after Prime Minister's question. But before we turn to domestic matters, I think it's right and important to raise the dire humanitarian situation that is developing in Afghanistan. The World Food Programme estimates that more than half the population, about 22.8 million people, face acute food insecurity. 3.2 million children under 5 could suffer acute malnutrition. Given the history of the last 20 years, it should be obvious that we have a deep responsibility to this country and to its people. Mr. Speaker, they are dying and they need our help. It is only 2 months since the Allied forces relinquished control of the country. So can the Prime Minister update us on what exactly his government is doing to end the famine in Afghanistan?
Hear, hear, hear. I thank the right honourable gentleman, and he raises an issue that I know is on the minds of many people in this House and across the country. We're proud of what we've done to welcome people from Afghanistan, but we must do everything we can also to mitigate the consequences for the people of Afghanistan of the Taliban takeover. And so what we did, as he will recall, is we doubled our aid commitment for this year to £286 million, and we're working with the UN agencies and other NGOs to do everything we can to help the people of Afghanistan. What we can't do at the moment is write a completely blank cheque to the Taliban government, the Taliban authorities. We need to ensure that that country does not slip back into being a haven for terrorism and a narco state.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is there is a humanitarian crisis and people are in need today. There is nothing there about tangible actions that the government is taking on the ground now, because the situation is getting worse by the day. In August, the Allies ran away from their responsibilities in Afghanistan, and now it very much feels like this government is washing its hands of the legacy that it left behind. Because not alone are the Afghan people being failed on humanitarian aid, promises made to them on resettlement are also being broken too. The Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme was announced on the 18th of August, which talked about resettling up to 20,000 in the coming years. But more than 2 months on, Mr. Speaker, we've heard nothing. The Afghan people are being left with no updates and vague targets. So can the Prime Minister finally tell us when the resettlement scheme will open? Can he guarantee, Prime Minister, that 20,000 Afghans will be resettled, and when exactly is the deadline for that to happen?
Mr. Speaker, we made a commitment to resettle 20,000 Afghans, in addition to those that we brought out under Operation Pitting, which I think most people, most fair-minded people in this country, would think was a pretty remarkable feat by UK armed services. And many of them are, of those 15,000 are already being integrated into the UK, into schools, into communities, and we will help them in any way that we can. And one of the reasons, and I'm afraid he's completely wrong in his characterisation of the stance the UK has taken towards Afghanistan and the changes there. We continue to engage. We engage with the Taliban. This country was one of the first to reach out and begin a dialogue. And what we are insisting on is safe passage, Mr. Speaker. And what we are insisting, just to get to his point where he rather uncivilly calls out, what we are insisting on, Mr. Speaker, is that there is safe passage for those who wish to come and settle in this country, for people to whom we owe an obligation. And that is what we are doing, Mr. Speaker. And I have answered the question.
David Warburton.
Okay. Thank you. As the whole House will know, today is National Cheese Toasty Day. A massive, it's a fact, a massive 4.3 billion toasties were consumed last year. They are the nation's favourite snack. And glorious Somerset is the home of cheddar cheese. So with the news that Wyke Farms in my constituency is now producing what I think is the world's first entirely carbon-neutral cheddar cheese, did my right honourable friend know that eating cheddar from Somerset can reduce your cheese consumption carbon footprint by 55%? So will my right honourable friend support our vital dairy industry by committing to enjoying a carbon-neutral cheese toasty today?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my only question is, why is it only National Cheese Toasty Day? Why isn't it International Cheese Toasty Day? And I hope very much that amongst its many achievements, the COP26 summit will bring the entire global community to a better understanding of the Wyke Farms carbon-neutral cheese toasty.
So Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware of the harm that the Northern Ireland Protocol is doing to the political and economic stability of Northern Ireland, and the very delicate constitutional balance created by the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement. In the command paper published by the government in July, they committed to addressing these issues and recognised that the protocol is simply not sustainable. Does the Prime Minister accept that the conditions now exist to trigger Article 16 of the protocol in the event that the current negotiations with the EU fail to arrive at an acceptable outcome?
So we can negotiate. The right honourable gentleman is completely right. I'm sad to say in what he says, and we're working hard to secure an agreement by negotiation, but we need to see real progress, because he knows the real life issues on the ground in Northern Ireland haven't gone away, and if we can't see progress, as we've been saying now for some months, if we can't see rapid progress in the way that we spelt out in our command paper, then I think that it's clear to everybody that the conditions for invoking Article 16 have already been met.
Robin Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Airedale Hospital in my constituency is made predominantly from aerated concrete, which is known for its structural deficiencies and is now in desperate need of a new rebuild. As the Prime Minister will be aware, the Airedale Hospital recently submitted its bid to government for a brand new carbon-neutral hospital. It is fantastic news that this Conservative government will deliver 48 new hospitals. But can I make an urgent plea to the Prime Minister that the Airedale is one of them?
Well, yes, Mr. Speaker, here with my honourable friend, we're hearing a little bit more. Indeed, the whole House will be hearing more about the spending for health in just a few moments. But I can tell him that we've received 120 applications for the biggest hospital building programme in a generation, and his application will certainly be amongst those who will get our most urgent consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is failing women and girls. From lack of rape prosecutions, no victims bill, to letting criminals off the hook. And now women and girls, including my own children, are being targeted with a sinister form of spiking through injections. It's always women and girls who pay the heaviest price. Now they are taking a stand today and saying enough is enough. So how many more women and girls will be hunted or excluded before the Prime Minister himself finally takes a stand?
Mr. Speaker, the reports of spiking are extremely disturbing, and as the Honourable Lady knows, it's already a criminal offence, and I know that the Home Secretary, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has asked the police to update her on exactly what details they have of what is happening. She wants to give them the space for the time being to conduct their inquiries into what's going on, but I would ask everybody with information about such incidents to come forward and contact their local police.
Morris.
With COP26 being imminent, I would like to draw attention to what good work's being done in Morecambe with the Eden project. Wes Johnson at Morecambe and Lancaster College has put forward a programme to teach youngsters in Morecambe the international Eden ethos to, shall we say, propagate the goodwill around the world. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to come to Morecambe and come to the Morecambe Riviera to see the Eden project site at the earliest convenience. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to respond in the affirmative, but to my honourable friend, because I think the last time he asked me about this, it was to ensure that we got an Eden project in Morecambe. So it sounds from what he's saying as though we're making progress in that direction, and that is thrilling.
Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will want to send my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, our best wishes. And it's also good, Mr. Speaker, to see a few more Conservative MPs heeding the Health Secretary's plea and wearing masks in this chamber. But given we have had for several weeks now COVID infection, hospitalisation and death rates far, far higher than any other Western European country, was it a mistake to abandon all those precautions back in July? And if not, why are our figures so bad?
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question, but the reality is that, of course, we monitor all the data very carefully every day, but we see nothing to suggest that we need to deviate from the plan that we've set out that began with the roadmap in February and that we are sticking to, that has given business and given this country to get on and achieve the unlockings that we've seen and indeed the fastest economic growth in the G7.
Jane Hunt.
Speaker, my Loughborough constituent Sophia Davey has composed a song about the positive action we can each take to combat climate change, which emphasises the need to clean, repair and protect. Will the Prime Minister join me in encouraging all UK schools to follow the lead of Fairfield Prep School in Loughborough and other schools across the world from Hawaii to Norway in raising awareness of this important issue through learning the song?
Well, yes, Mr. Speaker. Do I have to learn the song? I'll do my best, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my honourable friend for raising the work of her constituents and her constituent school. And it is absolutely vital that we not only recycle where it's sensible, but above all, we cut down on the use of plastics, Mr. Speaker.
Sarah Sultana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week it was revealed that fossil fuel companies, interest groups and climate denialists have donated £1.3 million to the Conservative Party and its MPs since 2019. So a simple question, no waffling or dodging the issue. On the eve of COP26, will the Prime Minister demonstrate that he is serious about tackling the climate emergency by paying back this money and pledging that his party will never again take money and donations from the fossil fuel companies that are burning our planet? Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, all our donations are registered in the normal way, and I just remind her that the Labour Party's paymasters, the GMB, think Labour's policies mean that no families would have only to take one flight every 5 years, Mr. Speaker, and have their cars confiscated.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week it's UK Wind Week, and later this afternoon I'll be welcoming some young people from my constituency who see their futures in the renewable energy sector, which has done so much to level up the Grimsby, Cleethorpes and North East Lincolnshire. Will the Prime Minister give an assurance that the government will continue to invest in the skills and development of our young people to benefit the regional renewable energy sector?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I think the whole House should be proud of the fact that the UK now produces more offshore wind, still produces more offshore wind than it. Not hot air, Mr. Speaker, but energy for the people of this country. Clean, green energy produced off Cleethorpes, in the North Sea, and we're massively going to be increasing the volume of that output, Mr. Speaker.
Stephen Kinnock.
Mr. Speaker, a thriving steel industry is the foundation of a more productive and resilient Britain. Yet bickering between the Chancellor and the Business Secretary is blocking the chance to tackle the sky-high energy prices that our steelmakers have been facing since long before the current price spikes. With the pathway to net zero dependent on steel firms using more electricity, not less, will he urge his colleagues around the Cabinet table to now put in place a wholesale energy price cap, along with long overdue reductions in network connection costs? Mr. Speaker, COP won't work without a cap.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he's making a very important point about the high energy costs for energy-intensive industries, and that's why we've abated them, but with about £2 billion since 2013. But the answer is to do what we're doing to make up the long-term baseload needs of this economy by investing in nuclear, which I'm afraid Labour failed to do in their 13 lost years, Mr. Speaker, as well as in renewables.
Prime Minister's questions.
So that brings us to the end of Prime Minister's questions. And you saw there, just very briefly, Sir Lindsay Hoyle vacating his Speaker's chair. That's because there is a reset ahead of the budget, and we can now see Eleanor Lang taking her place because she will be, as Chairman of Ways and Means, presiding over the budget proceedings. But just as Prime Minister's questions were starting, there was a flurry of excitement and interest because there was a change of personnel. You will have noticed Keir Starmer was not in his usual place asking the questions. It was, in fact, someone who was once familiar, of course, with Prime Minister's questions, and that's Ed Miliband,
That's right.
the Shadow Secretary of State for Business and Energy, because he's got COVID.
That's right. So literally, while we were chatting, Joe, at 1 minute to 12, I looked down just as we went into the chamber to show our viewers, and I had a message from someone in the Labour team saying Keir Starmer has tested positive for COVID. He has isolated on several occasions before and been very frustrated, actually, during that whole process, but he has tested positive for COVID. So with 20 minutes to go, the Labour Party decided to switch in Ed Miliband, who now is the Shadow Business Secretary. They'd already decided to talk about the climate conference starting in a few days' time, which, of course, is his specialist subject. So the subject was the same, but the personnel was very different. Another complication, by rights, it would have normally been Angela Rayner, who is Keir Starmer's deputy.
Yes.
She's still away from Westminster on bereavement leave. So right now what's happening is there's a whole sort of flurry of people who've been in and around Keir Starmer for the last few days being tested.
Trying to find out if anybody else is testing positive.
Rachel Reeves is apparently tested negative for COVID.
That's the Shadow Chancellor.
And she will be doing the budget response, because by awkward tradition, it's normally the Leader of the Opposition that does the budget response. You know, the worst round of mastermind ever for a politician.
Yes.
But Keir Starmer, I think, will actually be really frustrated not to be able to do that today.
Absolutely. As you say, not an easy job, of course,
No.
to respond to the government, to the Chancellor on Budget Day, but certainly certainly they wouldn't have wanted this to unfold so
close,
close, of course, to the moment. But Rachel Reeves will have her chance, the Shadow Chancellor, to step into Keir Starmer's shoes and give that response. Of course, she will have been pretty well briefed on everything, as she knows the sort of material that is going to be dealt with. But still, having to step up and do that at the last minute isn't easy.
It's a huge moment for her. Normally what you see, though, is the Shadow Chancellor whispering in the ear of the Leader of the Opposition throughout the budget, trying to sort of help them look out for potential traps or potential political opportunities for them. Rachel Reeves, though, she's these days she's a very well-respected figure. She was a former economist at the Bank of England. You know, there are no flies on Rachel Reeves, so I don't think she'll be caught out on any of the detail. But it is a nightmare of a political moment to handle, even if you are the most expert economist in all of Westminster.
Well, meanwhile, you can see the chamber there, as we said early on, pretty packed. Interesting to note, masks being worn. They did seem to be more prevalent on the Conservative benches. They have been on the Labour benches. You could see the Prime Minister being flanked by the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, and Rishi Sunak, obviously the Chancellor, who will be standing up very soon to deliver his budget. And here he is.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've heard your words and those of Mr. Speaker. I have the greatest respect for you both, and I want to assure you that I have listened very carefully to what you have said. And may I also, Madam Deputy Speaker, send my best wishes to the Leader of the Opposition, and I know the whole House will join me in doing that. And now, with your permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, let me turn to today's budget. Madam Deputy Speaker, employment is up, investment is growing, public services are improving, the public finances are stabilising, and wages are rising. Today's budget delivers a stronger economy for the British people, stronger growth with the UK recovering faster than our major competitors, stronger public finances with our debt under control, stronger employment with fewer people out of work and more people in work. Growth up, jobs up and debt down. Let there be no doubt our plan is working. Madam Deputy Speaker, this budget is about what this government is about. Investment in a more innovative, high-skilled economy, because that is the only sustainable path to individual prosperity. World-class public services, because these are the common goods from which we all benefit. Backing business, because our future cannot be built by government alone, but must come from the imagination and drive of our entrepreneurs. Help for working families with the cost of living, because we will always give people the support they need and the tools to build a better life for themselves. And levelling up, because for too long, far too long, the location of your birth has determined too much of your future, because the awesome power of opportunity shouldn't be available only to a wealthy few, but be the birthright of every child in an independent and prosperous United Kingdom. Madam Deputy Speaker, today's budget does not draw a line under COVID. We have challenging months ahead. And let me encourage everyone eligible to get their booster jabs as soon as possible. But today's budget does begin the work of preparing for a new economy post-COVID. The Prime Minister's economy of higher wages, higher skills and rising productivity, of strong public services, vibrant communities and safer streets, an economy fit for a new age of optimism, where the only limit to our potential is the effort we are prepared to put in and the sacrifices we are prepared to make. That is the stronger economy of the future, and this budget is the foundation. Madam Deputy Speaker, the House will recognise the challenging backdrop of rising inflation. Let me begin by carefully explaining what is happening in our economy and why. Inflation in September was 3.1% and is likely to rise further, with the OBR expecting CPI to average 4% over the next year. The majority of this rise in inflation can be explained by two global forces. First, as economies around the world reopen, demand for goods has increased more quickly than supply chains can meet. Having been shut down for almost a year, it takes time for factories to scale up production, for container ships to move goods to where demand is, for businesses to hire the people they need. And second, global demand for energy has surged at a time when supplies have already been disrupted, putting a strain on prices. In the year to September, the global wholesale price of oil, coal and gas combined has more than doubled. The pressures caused by supply chains and energy prices will take months to ease. It would be irresponsible for anyone to pretend that we can solve this overnight. I am in regular communication with finance ministers around the world, and it's clear these are shared global problems, neither unique to the UK nor possible for us to address on our own. But where the government can ease these pressures, we will act. To address the driver shortage, the Transport Secretary is introducing temporary visas, tackling testing backlogs, changing cabotage requirements, and is today announcing new funding to improve lorry park facilities. We've already suspended the HGV levy until August, and I can do more today, extending it for a further year until 2023 and freezing vehicle excise duty for heavy goods vehicles. To help with the cost of living, we've introduced a new £500 million household support fund, and today's budget will support working families further. And in terms of our fiscal policy, we are going to meet our commitments on public services and capital investment, but we are going to do so keeping in mind the need to control inflation. And finally, I have written to the Governor of the Bank of England today to reaffirm their remit to achieve low and stable inflation. And people should be reassured they have a strong track record in doing so. I understand people are concerned about global inflation, but they have a government here at home ready and willing to act. And Madam Deputy Speaker, in a period of global uncertainty, you need to work hard to maintain a strong economy and be responsible with the public finances, and that is what we are doing. I'm grateful to the OBR for their work, and I'm pleased to say they now expect our recovery to be quicker. Thanks to this government's actions, they forecast the economy to return to its pre-COVID level at the turn of the year, earlier than they thought in March. Growth this year is revised up from 4 to 6.5%. The OBR then expect the economy to grow by 6% in 2022 and 2.1%, 1.3% and 1.6% over the next 3 years. In July last year, at the height of the pandemic, unemployment was expected to peak at 12%. Today, the OBR expect unemployment to peak at just 5.2%. That means over 2 million fewer people out of work than previously feared. And wages are rising. Compared to February 2020, they have grown in real terms by almost 3.5%. And I can confirm for the House the OBR's forecast for business investment has been revised up over the next 5 years. And because of the actions we took to support our economy, we have been more successful than previously feared in preventing the long-term economic damage of COVID. The OBR have today revised down their scarring assumption from 3% to 2%. In the depths of the worst economic crisis on record, we set out a plan for jobs, a plan that was backed by business groups and trade bodies, a plan that has helped millions of people and saved millions of jobs, a plan that the OBR have today described as remarkably successful. Madam Deputy Speaker, today's forecast confirm beyond doubt our plan for jobs is working. And Madam Deputy Speaker, disruption in the global economy highlights the importance of strong public finances. Coronavirus left us with borrowing higher than at any time since the Second World War. As the Prime Minister reminded us in his conference speech, higher borrowing today is just higher interest rates and even higher taxes tomorrow. So we need to strengthen our public finances so that when the next crisis comes, we have the fiscal space to act. Today, I am publishing a new Charter for Budget Responsibility. The Charter sets out 2 fiscal rules which will keep this government on the path of discipline and responsibility. First, underlying public sector net debt, excluding the impact of the Bank of England, must, as a percentage of GDP, be falling. Second, in normal times, the state should only borrow to invest in our future growth and prosperity. Everyday spending must be paid through taxation. Both rules must be met by the 3rd year of every forecast period, giving us the flexibility to respond to crises while credibly keeping our public finances under control. These rules are supplemented by targets to spend up to 3% of GDP on capital investment and keep welfare spending on a sustainable path. Madam Deputy Speaker, the House will be asked to vote on our Charter, giving members a simple choice: to abandon our fiscal anchor and leave our economy adrift with reckless, unfunded pledges, or to vote for what we on this side of the House know is the right course: sound public finances and a stronger economy for the British people. Madam Deputy Speaker, important as the Charter is, our credibility comes as much from what we do as what we say. So I'm pleased to tell the House that because our plan is delivering a stronger economy, and because we've taken tough but responsible decisions on public finances, the OBR report today that all our fiscal rules have been met. Underlying debt is forecast to be 85.2% of GDP this year, then 85.4% of GDP in 22-23, before peaking at 85.7% in 23-24. It then falls in the final 3 years of the forecast from 85.1 to 83.3%. Borrowing as a percentage of GDP is forecast to fall in every single year, from 7.9% this year to 3.3% next, then 2.4%, 1.7%, 1.7%, and 1.5% in the following years. Borrowing down, debt down, proving once again it is the Conservatives, and only the Conservatives, who can be trusted with taxpayers' money. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have made 4 fiscal judgments in this budget. First, we will meet our fiscal rules with a margin to protect ourselves against economic risks. That is the responsible decision at a time of increasing global economic uncertainty, when our public finances are twice as sensitive to changes in interest rates as they were before the pandemic, and 6 times as sensitive as they were before the financial crisis. Just a 1 percentage point in inflation and interest rates would cost us around £23 billion. My second judgment today is to continue supporting working families. Third, as well as helping people at home, our improving fiscal situation means we will meet our obligations to the world's poorest. I told the House that when we met our fiscal tests, we would return to spending 0.7% of our national income on overseas aid. Some people said this was a trick or a device. I told this House it was no such thing, and based on the tests I set out, today's forecasts show that we are, in fact, scheduled to return to 0.7 in 24-25 before the end of this Parliament. And Madam Deputy Speaker, my fourth fiscal judgment is this: Today's budget increases total departmental spending over this Parliament by £150 billion. That's the largest increase this century, with spending growing by 3.8% a year in real terms. As a result of this spending review, and contrary to speculation, there will be a real terms rise in overall spending for every single department. And public sector net investment as a share of GDP will be at the highest sustained level for nearly half a century. If anybody still doubts it, today's budget confirms the Conservatives are the real party of public services. Madam Deputy Speaker, our stronger economy lays the foundation for everything we want to achieve in today's budget. World-class public services and more investment in our future growth. Before I turn to the details, I'd like to thank my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary. Yeah. Completing the spending review in such challenging circumstances was a tall order, and thankfully we had just the man for the job. Madam Deputy Speaker, at the start of this Parliament, resource spending on healthcare was £133 billion. Today's spending review confirms that by the end of this Parliament, it will increase by £44 billion to over £177 billion. And the extra revenue we're forecast to raise from the Health and Social Care Levy is going direct to the NHS and social care as promised. The health capital budget will be the largest since 2010. Record investment in health R&D, including better newborn screening, as campaigned for by the member for the cities of London and Westminster. 40 new hospitals, 70 hospital upgrades, more operating theatres to tackle the backlog, and 100 community diagnostic centres. All staffed by a bigger, better-trained workforce with 50,000 more nurses and 50 million more primary care appointments. As well as funding to deliver the Prime Minister's historic reforms to social care, we're providing local government with new grant funding over the next 3 years of £4.8 billion, the largest increase in core funding for over a decade. And we're investing more in housing and home ownership too, with a multi-year housing settlement totalling nearly £24 billion. £11.5 billion to build up to the 180,000 new affordable homes, the largest cash investment in a decade, 20% larger than the previous programme. And we're investing an extra £1.8 billion, enough to bring 1,500 hectares of brownfield land into use, meet our commitment to invest £10 billion in new housing, and unlock 1 million new homes. We're also confirming £5 billion to remove unsafe cladding from the highest risk buildings, partly funded by the Residential Property Developers Tax, which I can confirm will be levied on developers with profits over £25 million at a rate of 4%. And we've also reduced rough sleeping by over a third, but we will go further, with £640 million a year for rough sleeping and homelessness, an 85% increase in funding compared to 2019. Madam Deputy Speaker, today's budget funds our ambition to recruit 20,000 new police officers, provides an extra £2.2 billion for courts, prisons and probation services, including £500 million to reduce the courts' backlog, pays for programmes to tackle neighbourhood crime, reoffending, county lines, violence against women and girls, victim services, and improved responses to rape cases. And over the next 3 years, commits £3.8 billion to the largest prison building programme in a generation. Madam Deputy Speaker, all governments should aspire to provide greater life chances for future generations. But few governments can match our ambition. So let me now turn to what this budget does to support children. The evidence is compelling that the first 1,001 days of a child's life are the most important. my right honourable friend, the member for South Northamptonshire, has recognised this with her inspirational report. And we are responding today with £300 million for a Start for Life offer for families, high-quality parenting programmes, tailored services to help with perinatal mental health. And I'm pleased to tell the member for Congleton funding to create a network of family hubs around the country too, to improve the quality of childcare. We're going to pay providers more, with today's spending review providing an extra £170 million by 24-25. We're confirming £150 million to support training and development for the entire early years workforce, to help up to 300,000 more families facing multiple needs. We're investing an extra £200 million in the Supporting Families programme, and we will provide over £200 million a year to continue the Holiday Activity and Food programme. Today's spending review also delivers our commitment to schools with an extra £4.7 billion by 24-25, which, combined with the ambitious plans we announced at the spending review of 2019, will restore per-pupil funding to 2010 levels in real terms, equivalent to a cash increase for every pupil of more than £1,500. And for children with special educational needs and disabilities, we are more than tripling the amount we invest to create 30,000 new school places. And we know that the pandemic caused significant disruption to children's learning. We've already announced £3.1 billion to help education recovery. Today, as promised by the Prime Minister and the Education Secretary, we will go further with just under £2 billion of new funding to help schools and colleges, bringing this government's total support for education recovery to almost £5 billion. Madam Deputy Speaker, as we level up public services, we are also levelling up communities, restoring the pride people feel in the places they call home. To do that, we're providing £560 million for youth services, enough to fund up to 300 youth clubs across the country, over £200 million to build or transform 8,000 state-of-the-art community football pitches across the UK, funding to turn over 100 areas of derelict land into new pocket parks, and I'm allocating the first round of bids from the Levelling Up Fund. £1.7 billion to invest in the infrastructure of everyday life in over 100 local areas, with £170 million in Scotland, £120 million in Wales and £50 million in Northern Ireland, more than their Barnet shares. This will benefit the whole United Kingdom. We are backing projects in Aberdeen, Bury, Burnley, Lewes, Clwyd South, and not one, not two, but 3 successful projects for the great city of Stoke-on-Trent. But that's not all. We're also going to fund projects in Ashton-under-Lyne, South Leicester, Sunderland, Doncaster, and West Leeds. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are so committed to levelling up, we are even levelling up the opposition front bench. Madam Deputy Speaker, levelling up is also about protecting our unique culture and heritage. The British Museum, Tate Liverpool, the York Railway Museum, we're investing £800 million to protect museums, galleries, libraries and local culture. And thanks to the Culture Secretary, over 100 regional museums and libraries will be renovated, restored and revived. And she secured up to £2 million to start work on a new Beatles attraction on the Liverpool waterfront. We're also going to review our museum freedoms and make our creative tax reliefs more generous. On current plans, the tax relief for museums and galleries is due to end in March next year. just as exhibitions are starting to tour again. So I've decided to extend it for 2 years to March 2024. And to support theatres, orchestras, museums and galleries to recover from COVID, the tax reliefs for all those sectors from today until April 2023 will be doubled. And they won't return to the normal rate until April 2024. That's a tax relief for culture worth almost £250 million. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a budget for the whole United Kingdom. Through the Barnett formula, today's decisions increase Scottish Government funding in each year by an average of £4.6 billion. Welsh Government funding by £2.5 billion and £1.6 billion for the Northern Ireland Executive. This delivers in real terms the largest block grants for the devolved administration since the devolution settlements of 1998. The whole of the United Kingdom will benefit from the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and over time we will ramp up funding so that total domestic UK-wide funding will match EU receipts, averaging around £1.5 billion a year. And we will fund projects across the UK, including funding for the Extreme E race in Scotland, the 22 Hebrides X-Prix, accelerating funding for the Cardiff City Region deal in Wales, and funding in Northern Ireland for community cohesion. And whilst today demonstrates the indisputable fiscal benefit of being part of the United Kingdom, this is and always will be secondary to the simple truth that we are bound together by more than transactional benefit. It is our collective history, our culture, and our security. We are and always will be one family, one United Kingdom. Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst today's budget delivers historically high levels of public spending, its success will be measured not by the billions we spend, but by the outcomes we achieve and the difference we make to people's lives. The budgets are set, the plans are in place, the task is clear. Now we must deliver, because this isn't the government's money, it's taxpayers' money. Madam Deputy Speaker, our stronger economy allows us to fund world-class public services, the people's priority. But over the long term, the only way to pay for higher spending is economic growth. And if we want to see higher growth, we've got to tackle the problem that's been holding back this country for far too long: our uneven economic geography. As we come out of the worst economic shock we've ever seen, we've got a choice: to retrench or to invest. This government chooses to invest. To invest in our economic infrastructure, to invest in innovation, to invest in skills, to invest in a plan for growth that builds a stronger economy for the future. That's what this budget is about, and that's what this government is about. Madam Deputy Speaker, infrastructure connects our country, drives productivity, and levels up. That's why our national infrastructure strategy invests in economic infrastructure like roads, railways, broadband and mobile, over £130 billion. To connect our towns and cities, we're investing £21 billion on roads and £46 billion on railways. Our integrated rail plan will be published soon, dramatically improving journey times between our towns and cities. And today, we're providing £5.7 billion for London-style transport settlements in Greater Manchester, the Liverpool City region, the Tees Valley, South Yorkshire, West Midlands and the West of England. And we're helping local transport everywhere, with £2.6 billion for a long-term pipeline of over 50 local roads upgrades, over £5 billion for local roads maintenance, enough to fill 1 million more potholes a year, and funding for buses, cycling and walking, totalling more than £5 billion. The Prime Minister promised an infrastructure revolution. This budget delivers an infrastructure revolution. Madam Deputy Speaker, investment in our infrastructure is just the first step. We need to do what the people of this country have always done: invent, discover, and create the ideas and technologies that will change the world. So we will also invest more in innovation. The UK is already a world leader. With less than 1% of the world's population, we have 4 of the world's top 20 universities, 14% of the world's most impactful research, and the second most Nobel laureates. We want to go further. I can confirm we will maintain our target to increase R&D investment to £22 billion. But in order to get there and deliver on our other priorities, we'll reach the target in 26-27, spending by the end of this Parliament £20 billion a year on R&D. That's a cash increase of 50%, the fastest increase ever. And I can confirm for the House that this £20 billion is in addition to the cost of our R&D tax reliefs. Combined with those tax reliefs, total public investment in R&D is increasing from 0.7% of GDP in 2018 to 1.1% of GDP by the end of the Parliament. How does 1.1% compare internationally? Well, the latest available data shows an OECD average of just 0.7%. Germany investing 0.9%, France 1%, and the United States just 0.7%. This unprecedented funding will increase core science funding to £5.9 billion per year by 24-25, a cash increase of 37%. Meet the full cost of associating with Horizon Europe. Establish the new Advanced Research and Invention Agency with £800 million by 25-26, and strengthen our focus on late-stage innovation, increasing Innovate UK's annual core budget to £1 billion, double what it was at the start of this Parliament. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's more to becoming a science superpower than just what the government spends on R&D. Our ambitious net zero strategy is also an innovation strategy, investing £30 billion to create the new green industries of the future. We've just issued our second green bond, making us the 3rd largest issuer of sovereign green bonds anywhere in the world. London last week was named the best place in the world for green finance. And on Monday, the new UK Infrastructure Bank announced its first ever investment, £107 million to support offshore wind in Teesside. And to build on this work, 1 week today, I'll be hosting global finance ministers and businesses at COP26. And Madam Deputy Speaker, innovation comes from the imagination, drive, and risk-taking of business. That's why we've launched Help to Grow for turbocharged SME productivity, started a new co-investment venture capital fund, Future Fund Breakthrough. It's why I'm announcing today we will consult on further changes to the regulatory charge cap for pension schemes, unlocking institutional investment whilst protecting savers. It's why we're introducing a new £1.4 billion Global Britain Investment Fund, supporting transformative economic activity and our world-leading sectors like life sciences. And it's why today's budget increases the British Business Bank's regional financing programmes to £1.6 billion, expanding their coverage and helping innovative businesses get access to the finance they need across the whole United Kingdom. Madam Deputy Speaker, a third of our science Nobel laureates have been immigrants. Half of our fastest growing companies have a foreign-born founder. So an economy built on innovation must be open and attractive to the best and brightest minds. Thanks to our brilliant Home Secretary, today's budget confirms the eligibility criteria for our new scale-up visa, making it quicker and easier for the fast-growing businesses to bring in highly skilled individuals. And the Trade Secretary's new Global Talent Network, launching initially in the Bay Area, Boston and Bangalore, will identify, attract and relocate the best global talent in science and tech sectors. all part of our plan to make our visa system for international talent the most competitive in the world. Madam Deputy Speaker, if we want greater private sector innovation, we need to make our research and development tax reliefs fit for purpose. The latest figures show the UK has the second highest spending on R&D tax reliefs in the OECD, yet it's not working as well as it should. UK business investment in R&D is less than half the OECD average. We've reviewed the reliefs and identified two issues we are solving today. First, the reliefs need to reflect how businesses conduct research in the modern world. So, as many companies have called for, I'm expanding the scope of the reliefs to include cloud computing and data costs. The second problem is this. Companies claimed UK tax relief on £48 billion of R&D spending. Yet UK business investment was around half of that, at just £26 billion. We are subsidising billions of pounds of R&D that isn't even happening here in the United Kingdom. That's unfair on British taxpayers, and it puts us out of step with places like Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, Singapore, Switzerland, and the USA, who have all focused their R&D tax reliefs on domestic activity. So from April 2023, we are going to do the same and incentivise greater investment here at home. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, £22 billion investment in R&D, the Net Zero Strategy, the Future Fund, Help to Grow, more regional finance, unlocking institutional capital, a more competitive visa system, and a modernised R&D tax credits regime. Enough action to prove the hypothesis we are making this country a science and technology superpower. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, as well as investing in infrastructure and innovation, there is one further part of our plan for growth that is crucial: providing a world-class education to all our people. Higher skills lead to higher regional productivity, and higher productivity leads to higher wages. With 80% of the UK's 2030 workforce already in work, our future success depends not just on the schooling we give our children, but the lifelong learning we offer to adults. We've already done a lot. Our plan for jobs invested in apprenticeships, traineeships, and the Kickstart scheme, but we need to go further. Today's budget invests in the most wide-ranging skills agenda this country has seen in decades. We are increasing skills spending over the Parliament by £3.8 billion, an increase of 42%. We're expanding T-levels, building institutes of technology, rolling out the Prime Minister's Lifetime Skills Guarantee, upgrading our FE College estate, quadrupling the number of places on skills boot camps, and significantly increasing funding for apprenticeships. We are also going to tackle a tragic fact. Millions of adults in our country have numeracy skills lower than those expected of a 9-year-old. According to the leading charity, National Numeracy, this costs individuals with poor numeracy up to £1,600 a year in lost earnings. People with poor numeracy skills are more than twice as likely to be unemployed as their peers. So today, I can announce a new UK-wide numeracy programme, Multiply. With £560 million, Multiply will improve basic math skills and help to change people's lives across the whole United Kingdom. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, we're building our infrastructure with new roads, railways and broadband, cementing our status as a science and technology superpower, and strengthening the skills of our people, the country's greatest asset. That is a real plan for growth, and that's how this government is building a stronger economy for the British people. Madam Deputy Speaker, world-class public services are the people's priority. Investment in infrastructure, innovation and skills will create the growth that we need to pay for them. But as Conservatives, we know that government action alone won't be enough to create a stronger economy. We want this country to be the most exciting and dynamic place in the world for business. And now that we've left the EU, we have the freedom to do things differently and deliver a simpler, fairer tax system. I want to begin with one of our smallest taxes, but a tax which plays an important role in one of our preeminent industries, shipping. Now that we've left the EU, today we start reforming our tonnage tax regime to make it simpler and more competitive. And we're also making it fairer for UK taxpayers. When we were in the old EU system, ships in the tonnage tax regime were required to fly the flag of an EU state. But that doesn't make sense for an independent nation, so I can announce today that our tonnage tax will, for the first time ever, reward companies for adopting the UK merchant shipping flag, the red ensign. That is entirely fitting for a country with such a proud maritime history as ours. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am sure the opposition will be delighted that red flags are still flying somewhere in this country, even if they are all at sea. Let me turn now to air passenger duty. Right now, people pay more for return flights with and between the 4 nations of the United Kingdom than they do when flying home from abroad. We used to have a return leg exemption for domestic flights, but were required to remove it in 2001. But today, I can announce that flights between airports in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will, from April 2023, be subject to a new, lower rate of air passenger duty. This will help cut the cost of living, with 9 million passengers seeing their duty cut by half. It will bring people together across the United Kingdom. And because they tend to have a greater proportion of domestic passengers, it is a boost to regional airports like Aberdeen, Belfast, Inverness and Southampton. Airports are major regional employers. So to help them get through the winter, I'm also extending our support for English airports for a further 6 months. We're also making changes to reduce carbon emissions from aviation. Most emissions come from international rather than domestic aviation. So we are introducing from April 2023 a new ultra-long-haul band in air passenger duty covering flights of over 5,500 miles with an economy rate of £91. Less than 5% of passengers will pay more, but those who fly furthest will pay the most. Madam Deputy Speaker, our approach to corporate taxation strikes a responsible balance between funding public services and encouraging the investment we need for a stronger economy. At the March budget, we took the difficult but necessary decision to increase the rate of corporation tax to 25% from 2023. Still, the lowest rate in the G7 and the 5th lowest rate in the G20. Alongside, I introduced the new super deduction, the biggest business tax cut in modern British history, and extended to the end of this year the annual investment allowance at its higher level of £1 million. Now is not the time to remove tax breaks on investment, so I can confirm today that the £1 million annual investment allowance will not end in December as planned. It will be extended all the way to March 2023. I also said in March that I would review the bank surcharge within corporation tax to maintain the competitiveness of our financial services industry. We will retain a surcharge of 3%. The overall rate for corporation tax on banks will, in 2023, increase from 27% to 28% and will remain higher than the rate paid by other companies. Small challenger banks are improving banking competition, which is good for the sector and good for consumers. So to help them, I will also raise the annual allowance to £100 million. Madam Deputy Speaker, our manifesto promised to review business rates. We're publishing our conclusions today. But before I set out our plans, let me say this. We on this side of the House are clear that reckless, unfunded promises to abolish a tax which raises £25 billion every year are completely irresponsible. It would be wrong to find £25 billion a year in extra borrowing, cuts to public services or tax rises elsewhere. So we will retain business rates, but with key reforms to ease the burden and create stronger high streets. First, we will make the business rate system fairer and timelier, with more frequent revaluations every 3 years. The new revaluation cycle will be delivered from 2023. Second, as called for by the Federation of Small Business and the British Property Federation, we're introducing a new investment relief to encourage businesses to adopt green technologies like solar panels. And I'm announcing today that we'll accept the CBI and the British Retail Consortium's recommendation to introduce a new business rates improvement relief. From 2023, every single business will be able to make property improvements and for 12 months pay no extra business rates. That means a hotel adding extra rooms, a manufacturer expanding their factory, an office adding new air conditioning, CCTV or bike shelters will all pay no extra rates. Together with the new green investment relief, we're introducing investment incentives totalling £750 million. This will make a difference, but without action, millions of businesses would see their tax bills going up next year because of inflation. I want to help those businesses right now. So our third step is that next year's planned increase in the multiplier will be cancelled. That's a tax cut for businesses worth over the next 5 years £4.6 billion. And I have one final measure to help those businesses hardest hit by the pandemic. I'm announcing today, for 1 year, a new 50% business rates discount for businesses in the retail, hospitality and leisure sectors. Pubs, music venues, cinemas, restaurants, hotels, theatres and gyms. Any eligible business can claim a discount on their bills of 50% up to a maximum of £110,000. That is a business tax cut worth almost £1.7 billion. Together with small business rate relief, this means that over 90% of all retail, hospitality and leisure businesses will see a discount of at least 50%. Apart from the COVID reliefs, this is the biggest single-year tax cut to business rates in over 30 years. Madam Deputy Speaker, taken together, today's budget cuts business rates by £7 billion. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are unleashing the dynamism and creativity of British businesses with a simpler, fairer and more competitive tax system. The biggest business tax cut in modern British history, the biggest single-year tax cut to business rates for 30 years, £1 million investment allowance, tonnage tax reformed, air passenger duty cut. That is the way to back business and build a stronger economy. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me turn now to alcohol duties. First introduced in 1643 to help pay for the Civil War, our alcohol duty system is outdated, complex, and full of historical anomalies. The Institute of Fiscal Studies have called it, in their words, a mess. The Institute of Economic Affairs said it defies common sense. And the World Health Organization have warned that countries like the UK, which follow the EU rules, are, and I quote, unable to implement tax systems that are optimal from the perspective of public health. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, today we are taking advantage of leaving the EU to announce the most radical simplification of alcohol duties for over 140 years. We are taking 5 steps today to create a system that is simpler, fairer, and healthier. First, to radically simplify the system, we are slashing the number of main duty rates from 15 to just 6. Our new system will be designed around a common sense principle. The stronger the drink, the higher the rate. This means that some drinks, like stronger red wines, fortified wines, or high-strength white ciders, will see a small increase in their rates because they are currently undertaxed given their strength. That's the right thing to do, and it will help end the era of cheap, high-strength drinks which can harm public health and enable problem drinking. And because this is a more rational system, the converse is also true. Many lower alcohol drinks are currently overtaxed and have been for many decades. Rosé, fruit ciders, liqueurs, lower strength beers and wines, today's changes mean that they will pay less. The second step I'm taking today will encourage small, innovative craft producers. I'm announcing proposals for a new small producer relief. This will extend the principle of small brewers relief to include, for the first time ever, small cider makers and other producers making alcoholic drinks of less than 8.5%. Third, I'm going to modernise the system to reflect the way that people drink today. Over the last decade, consumption of sparkling wines, like Prosecco, has doubled. English sparkling wine has increased almost tenfold. It's clear they are no longer the preserve of wealthy elites. And they are no stronger than still wines. So I'm going to end the irrational duty premium of 28% that they currently pay. Sparkling wines, wherever they are produced, will now pay the same duty as still wines of equivalent strength. And because growing conditions in the UK typically favour lower strength and sparkling wines, this means English and Welsh wines, compared with stronger imported wines, will now pay less. Sales of fruit cider have increased from 1 in 1,000 ciders sold in 2005 to 1 in 4 today. But they can pay 2 or 3 times as much duty as cider that is made with apples or pears. So we are cutting the duty on them too. The fourth step I'm taking today will directly support the home of British community life for centuries, our pubs. Even before the pandemic, pubs were struggling. Between 2000 and 2019, consumption in the on-trade fell by 40%. And many public health bodies recognise that pubs are often safer drinking environments than being at home. So, as the members for Dudley South and North West Durham will agree, a fairer, healthier system supports pubs. So I can announce today draft relief. Draft relief will apply a new, lower rate of duty on draft beer and cider. It will apply to drinks served from draft containers over 40 litres. It will particularly benefit community pubs who do 75% of their trade on draft. And let me tell the House the new rate. Draft relief will cut duty by 5%. That is the biggest cut to cider duty since 1923. The biggest cut to fruit ciders in a generation. The biggest cut to beer duty for 50 years. This is not temporary. It's a long-term investment in British pubs of £100 million a year and a permanent cut in the cost of a pint of 3p. And I cannot wait, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the opposition to accuse me tomorrow of beer barrel politics. Madam Deputy Speaker, these much-needed reforms will come into effect in February 2023. but I want to help the hospitality industry right now. So, for my final announcement on alcohol duties today, I can confirm that the planned increase in duty on spirits like Scotch whisky, wine, cider and beer will all, from midnight tonight, be cancelled. That's a tax cut worth £3 billion. Madam Deputy Speaker, our reforms make the alcohol duty system simpler, fairer and healthier. They help with the cost of living while tackling problem drinking. They support innovative entrepreneurs and craft producers. They back pubs and public health. And they are only possible because we've left the European Union. Madam Deputy Speaker, world-class public services, investment in infrastructure, innovation and skills, simpler, fairer taxes to support businesses and consumers, all built on the foundation of a stronger economy and responsible public finances. That is our vision for the future, and that is what this budget delivers. And this budget also supports working families. Madam Deputy Speaker, with fuel prices at the highest level in 8 years, I'm not prepared to add to the squeeze on families and small businesses. So I can confirm today the planned rise in fuel duty will be cancelled. That's a saving over the next 5 years of almost £8 billion. Compared to pre-2010 plans, today's freeze means the average tank of fuel will cost around £15 less per car, £30 less for vans, £130 less for HGVs. After 12 consecutive years of frozen rates, the average car driver will now save a total of £1,900. Madam Deputy Speaker, I can also announce today that public sector workers will see fair and affordable pay rises across the whole spending review period as we return to the normal, independent pay-setting process. And I can take action to help the lowest paid as well. It was a Conservative government that introduced the national living wage in 2016. A Conservative government that, according to statistics published just yesterday, has overseen the proportion of people in low-paid work falling to its lowest level since 1997. And it is a Conservative government that is increasing the wage floor again today. The Independent Low Pay Commission brings together economists, business groups and trades unions. The government is accepting their recommendation to increase the national living wage next year by 6.6% to £9.50 an hour. For a full-time worker, that's a pay rise worth over £1,000. It will benefit over 2 million of the lowest paid workers in the country. It's broadly consistent with previous increases and keeps us on track for our target of 2/3 of median earnings by 2024. And it is a major commitment to the high-wage, high-skill, high-productivity economy of the future. Madam Deputy Speaker, as we build this stronger economy, we're doing so at the end of an extraordinary 18 months. COVID wasn't just a public health challenge. It wasn't just an economic challenge. It was a moral challenge too. We had to show that we could pull together as a country, and we did. We had to put aside questions of ideology and orthodoxy to do whatever it took to care for our people and each other, and we did. There's a different kind of moral dimension to the economic challenge we face now. Last year, the state grew to be over half the size of the total economy. Taxes are rising to their highest level as a percentage of GDP since the 1950s. I don't like it, but I cannot apologise for it. It is the result of the unprecedented crisis we faced and the extraordinary action we took in response. But now we have a choice. Do we want to live in a country where the response to every question is what is the government going to do about it? Where every time prices rise, every time a company gets in trouble, every time some new challenge emerges, the answer is always the taxpayer must pay? Or do we choose to recognise that government has limits? Government should have limits. If this seems a controversial statement to make, then I'm all the more glad for saying it, because that means it needed saying, and it is what we believe. There is a reason we talk about the importance of family, community, and personal responsibility, not because these are an alternative to the market or the state. It's because they are more important than the market or the state. The moments that make life worth living aren't created by government, aren't announced by government, aren't granted by government. They come from us as people, our choices, our sacrifices, our efforts. And we believe people should keep more of the rewards of those efforts. Yes, we've taken some corrective action to fund the NHS and get our debt under control. But as we look towards the future, I want to say this simple thing to the House and the British people. My goal is to reduce taxes. By the end of this Parliament, I want taxes to be going down, not up. I want this to be a society that rewards energy, ingenuity and inventiveness, a society that rewards work. That is what we believe on this side of the House. That is my mission over the remainder of this Parliament. And the final announcement in today's budget takes a first step. Madam Deputy Speaker, for many of the lowest paid in society, there is a hidden tax on work. The universal credit taper withdraws support as people work more hours. The rate is currently 63%, so for every £1 someone earns, their universal credit is reduced by 63p. Let us be in no doubt, this is a tax on work, and a high rate of tax at that. Organisations as varied as the Trades Union Congress, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Resolution Foundation, the Centre for Policy Studies and the Centre for Social Justice have all said it is too high. So, to make sure work pays and help some of the lowest income families in our country keep more of their hard-earned money, I have decided to cut this rate, not by 1%, not by 2%, but by 8%. This is a tax on working people, and we are cutting it from 63 to 55%. The rate originally envisaged by my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford. And because I'm also increasing the work allowances by £500, this is a tax cut next year worth over £2 billion. Nearly 2 million families will keep, on average, an extra £1,000 a year. Changes like this normally take effect at the start of the new tax year in April. But we want to help people right now. So we will introduce this within weeks and no later than December the 1st. Let me tell the House what these changes mean. A single mother of two, renting and working full-time on the national living wage, will be better off by around £1,200. A couple renting a home with their 2 children, one working full-time, the other working part-time, will be better off every single year by £1,800. This is a £2 billion tax cut for the lowest paid workers in our country. It supports working families, it helps with the cost of living, and it rewards work. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, fuel duty cut, air passenger duty cut, alcohol duty cut, the biggest cut to business rates in 30 years. Growth up, jobs up, wages up, public finances back in a better place, more investment in infrastructure, innovation and skills, a pay rise for over 2 million people and a £2 billion tax cut for the lowest paid. This budget helps with the cost of living. This budget levels up to a higher wage, higher skill, higher productivity economy. This budget builds a stronger economy for the British people, and I commend it to the House.
Well, there's the applause from the Conservative benches there for Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, who's been speaking for just over an hour. The rabbit out of the hat, as always, comes at the end, or pretty well always, and it was more generous than was expected. We had thought that there would be some change in terms of universal credit. If you remember, of course, in fact, many Tory MPs criticised the move to take away the £20 a week increase for universal credit claimants. This is actually dealing with the taper rate. What it will mean, says Rishi Sunak, is that more people, more families on the lowest incomes but working will be able to keep more of their earnings because they're going to reduce the tax rate from 63% to 55%. He said it's a tax cut worth £2 billion, and those families will be better off to the tune of £1,000 a year. We will talk about that in more detail, but you could see Therese Coffey, the Work and Pension Secretary, looking delighted, and a former Work and Pension Secretary, Ian Duncan-Smith, also looking very pleased. He, of course, amongst others, had actually pledged or tried to campaign for it to be removed, or kept, I should say, altogether. Let's have a look at some of the other headlines. If we wind back to the beginning of the budget, Rishi Sunak actually sort of set everything into context in terms of the economic background coming out of the COVID pandemic. He talked about the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility expecting inflation to hit 4%. It's about 3.1% now. We had been told by the Prime Minister in the past that it would be temporary. Well, today, Rishi Sunak said it will average out at 4% for the whole of next year. Growth expectation revised up from 4 to 6.5% this year. And every government department, remember we were talking about today being also about the spending review, to get real terms rise in spending each year. £11.5 billion for up to 180,000 new affordable homes. And again, another controversial issue, foreign aid spending to return to 0.7% of GDP before the end of the Parliament. Funnily enough, that was raised by Ed Miliband, who was actually facing Boris Johnson across the dispatch box instead of Keir Starmer, actually talked about that issue. We'll come back to all of these things, I hope, to some extent. We're going to speak to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Simon Clarke. I think we'll have to go back into the House now for the moment because Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, is going to give her response.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Families struggling with the cost of living crisis, businesses hit by a supply chain crisis, those who rely on our schools and our hospitals and our police. They won't recognise the world that the Chancellor is describing. They will think that he is living in a parallel universe. The Chancellor in this budget has decided to cut taxes for banks. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, at least the bankers on short-haul flights sipping champagne will be cheering this budget today. And the arrogance, after taking £6 billion out of the pockets of some of the poorest people in this country, expecting them to cheer today for £2 billion given to compensate. In the long story of this Parliament, never has a Chancellor asked the British people to pay so much for so little. Time and again today, the Chancellor compared the investments that he is making to the last decade. But who was in charge? Who was in charge in this last decade? They were. So let's just reflect on the choices that Chancellor has made today. The highest sustained tax burden in peacetime. And who is going to pay for it? It's not international giants like Amazon. No, the Chancellor has found a tax deduction for them. It's not property speculators. They've already pocketed a stamp duty cut. And it's clearly not the banks, even though bankers' bonuses are set to reach a record high this year. Instead, the Chancellor is loading the burden on working people. A national insurance tax rise on working people. A council tax hike on working people, and no support today for working people with VAT on their gas and electricity bills. And what are working people getting in return? A record NHS waiting list with no plan to clear it, no way to see a GP, and still having to sell their home to pay for social care. Community policing, nowhere to be seen. A court backlog leaving victims without justice. And almost every rape going unprosecuted. A growing gap in results and opportunities between children at private and state schools. Soaring number of pupils in supersized classes. And no serious plan to catch up on learning stolen by the virus. £2 billion announced today, a pale imitation of the £15 billion catch-up fund that the Prime Minister's own education czar said was needed. No wonder, Madam Deputy Speaker, that he resigned. Now, the Chancellor talks about world-class public services. Tell that to a pensioner waiting for a hip operation. Tell that to a young woman waiting to go to court to get justice. Tell that to a mum and dad waiting for their child to get the mental health support that they need. And the Chancellor says today that he's realised what a difference early years spending makes. I would just say to the Chancellor, has he ever heard of the Sure Start programme that this Tory government has cut?
You voted for it.
And why are we in this position? Why are British businesses being stifled by debt while Amazon gets tax deductions? Why are working people being asked to pay more tax and put up with worse services? Why is billions of pounds in taxpayers' money being funnelled to friends and donors of the Conservative Party, while millions of families are having £20 a week taken off of them? Madam Deputy Speaker, why can't Britain do better than this? Now, the government will always blame others. It's businesses' fault. It's the EU's fault. It's the public's fault. They're global problems. The same old excuses. But the blunt reality is this. Working people are being asked to pay more for less for three simple reasons: economic mismanagement, an unfair tax system, and wasteful spending. Each of these problems is down to 11 years of Conservative failure. And they shake their heads, but the cuts to our public services have cut them to the bone. And while the Chancellor and Prime Minister like to pretend that they are different, this budget today will only make things worse. The solution starts with growth. The government is caught in a bind of its own making, because low growth inexorably leads to less money for our public services, unless taxes rise. And under the Conservatives, Britain has become a low-growth economy. Let's look at the last decade. The Tories have grown the economy at just 1.8% a year. If we had grown at the same rate of other advanced economies, we could have had an additional £30 billion to invest in public services without raising the taxes that the Tories are raising on working people today. And let's compare growth under the last 11 years of Conservative government to the last Labour government. Even taking into account the global financial crisis, Labour grew the economy much faster, by 2.3% a year. If the Tories matched that record, we would have £30 billion more a year to spend on public services. It could not be clearer. The Conservatives are now the party of high taxation because the Conservatives are the party of low growth. And the Office for Budget Responsibility confirmed this today, that we will be back to anemic growth. They might not like this, but the Office of Budget Responsibility said that by the end of this Parliament, the UK economy will be growing by just 1.3%, which is hardly the plan for growth that the Chancellor boasted about today, hardly a ringing endorsement of his announcements. Under the Tory decade, we have had low growth, and there's not much growth to look forward to. Now, the economy has been weakened by the pandemic, but also by the government's mishandling of it. Responding to the virus has been a huge challenge. Governments around the world have taken on more debt, but our situation is worse than in other countries. Worse because our economy was already fragile going into the crisis. Too much inequality, too much insecure work, too little resilience in our public services. And worse, because the Prime Minister dithered and delayed, against scientific advice, egged on by the Chancellor, we ended up facing harsher and longer restrictions than other countries. So as well as having the highest death toll in Europe, Britain suffered the...
Order. We've got to be able to hear the Honourable Lady. Done. Rachel Reeves.
So as well as having the highest death toll in Europe, Britain has suffered the worst economic hit of any major economy. Now, the Chancellor now boasts that we are growing faster than others, but that's because we fell the furthest. And whilst the US and others have already seen their economy bounce back to levels seen before the pandemic, the UK hasn't. Our economy is set to be permanently weaker. On top of all that, the government is now lurching from crisis to crisis. People avoiding journeys because they can't fill up their petrol tank is not good for the economy. People spending less because the cost of the weekly shop has exploded is not good for the economy. And British exporters facing more barriers than their European competitors because of the deal that this government did is not good for our economy. If this were a plan, it would be economic sabotage. And when the Prime Minister isn't blagging that this chaos is part of his cunning plan, he says that he's not worried about inflation. Well, tell that to families struggling with rising gas and electricity bills, with rising prices of petrol at the pump, and with rising food prices. He's out of touch, he's out of ideas, and he's left working people out of pocket. Madam Deputy Speaker, Conservative mismanagement has made the fiscal situation tight. And when times are tight, it's even more important to ensure that taxes are fair, that taxpayers get value for money, but this government fails on both fronts. We have a grossly unfair tax system, with the burden being heaped on working people. Successive budgets now have raised council tax, have raised income tax, and now they have raised national insurance too. But taxes on those with the broadest shoulders, those who earn their income from stocks and shares and dividends and property portfolios, they've been left barely untouched. Businesses based on the high streets are the lifeblood of our communities and often the first venture for entrepreneurs. But despite what the Chancellor has said today, businesses will still be held back by punitive and unfair business rates. The government has failed to tax the online giants and watered down global efforts to create a level playing field. And just when we needed every penny of public money to make a difference, we have a government that is a byword for waste, cronyism and vanity projects. We've had £37 billion for a test and trace system that the spending watchdog says treats taxpayers like an ATM cash machine. A yacht for ministers, a fancy paint job for the Prime Minister's plane, and a TV studio for Conservative Party broadcasts, which seems to have morphed into the world's most expensive home cinema. £3.5 billion of government contracts awarded to friends and donors of the Conservative Party. A £190 million loan to a company employing the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff. £30 million to the former Health Secretary's pub landlord. And every single one of those cheques signed by the Chancellor. And now he comes to ordinary working people and asks them to pay more. More than they have been ever asked to pay before. And at the same time, to put up with worse public services, all because of his economic mismanagement, his unfair tax system, and his wasteful spending. Now, of course, there are some welcome measures in this budget today, as there are in any budget. Labour welcomes the increase in the national minimum wage, but the government needs to go further and faster. If they had backed Labour's position of an immediate rise to at least £10 an hour, then a full-time worker on the national minimum wage would be in line for an extra £1,000 a year. Ending the punitive public sector pay freeze is welcome, but we know how much this Chancellor likes his smoke and mirrors. So we'll be checking the books to make sure that the money is there for a real terms pay rise. Labour also welcomes the government's decision to reduce the universal credit taper rate, as we have consistently called for. But the system has got so out of whack that even after this reduction, working people on universal credit still face a higher marginal tax rate than the Prime Minister. And those unable to work through no fault of their own still face losing over £1,000 a year. And for families who go out to work every day but don't get government benefits, on an average wage, who have to fill up their car with petrol to get to work, who do that weekly shop, and who see their gas and electricity prices go up, this budget today does absolutely nothing for them. We have a cost of living crisis. The government has no coherent plan to help families cope with rising energy prices. And whilst we welcome the action taken today on universal credit, millions will still struggle to pay the bills this winter. The government has done nothing to help people with their gas and electricity bills with that cut in VAT receipts, as Labour has called for. A cut that is possible because we are outside the European Union and could be funded by the extra VAT receipts that have been experienced in the last few months. Working people are left out in the cold while the government hammers them with tax rises. Now, national insurance is a regressive tax on working people. It is a tax on jobs. Under the Chancellor's plans, a landlord renting out dozens of properties won't pay a penny more in tax. But their tenants, in work, will face tax rises of hundreds of pounds a year. And he is failing to tackle another huge issue of the day: adapting to climate change. Adapting to climate change presents opportunities. More jobs, lower bills and cleaner air. But only if we act now and if we act at scale. According to the Office for Budget Responsibility, failure to act will mean public sector debt explodes later to nearly 300% of GDP. The only way to be a prudent and responsible Chancellor is to be a green Chancellor, to invest in the transition to a zero-carbon economy and give British businesses a head start in the industries of the future. But with no mention of climate in his conference speech and the most passing of references today, we are burdened with a Chancellor unwilling to meet the scale of the challenges we face. Homeowners are left to face the costs of insulation on their own. Industries like steel and hydrogen are in a global race, but without the support that they need. And the Chancellor today has promoted domestic flights over high-speed rail in the week before COP26. And it is because of this, Chancellor, that in this very week that we try and persuade other countries to reduce their emissions, this government can't even confirm that it will meet its 2035 climate reduction target. Madam Deputy Speaker, everywhere working people look at the moment, they see prices going up and they see shortages on the shelves. But this budget did nothing to address their fears. Household budgets are being stretched thinner than ever. But this budget did nothing to deal with the spiralling cost of living. It is a shocking missed opportunity by a government that is completely out of touch. There is an alternative. Rather than just tweak the system, Labour would scrap business rates and replace it with something much better by ensuring online giants pay their fair share. That's what being pro-business looks like. We wouldn't put up national insurance for working people. We would ensure that those with the broadest shoulders pay their fair share. That's what being on the side of working people looks like. We'd end the £1.7 billion subsidy that the government gives to private schools and put it straight into our local state schools. That's what being on the side of working families looks like. And we deliver a climate investment pledge, £28 billion every year for the rest of this decade. That's gigafactories to build batteries for electric vehicles. That's a thriving hydrogen industry, creating jobs in all parts of our country, and retrofitting so that we keep homes warm and get our energy bills down. That's what real action on climate change looks like. This country deserves better, but they'll never get it under this Chancellor, who gives with one hand but takes so much more with the other. The truth is this. What you get with these two is a classic con game. It's like one of those pickpocketing operations that you see in crowded places. The Prime Minister is the front man, distracting people with his wild promises. All the while, the Chancellor dips his hand in their pockets. It all seems like fun and games until you walk away and find that your purse has been lifted. But people are getting wise to them. Every month they feel the pinch. They're tired of the smoke and mirrors. They're tired of the bluster, of the false dawns, of the promises of jam tomorrow. Labour would put working people first, would use the power of government and the skill of business to ensure that the next generation of quality jobs are created right here in Britain. We'd tax fairly, spend wisely, and after a decade of faltering growth, we'd get the Britain's economy firing on all cylinders. That is what a Labour budget would have done today.
Well, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, of course, it wasn't supposed to be her standing there giving the response to the government, to Rishi Sunak, but of course Keir Starmer can't be there because he's isolating. A very robust, strong, forceful response from Rachel Reeves, accusing both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor there at the end of being con artists when it comes to spending taxpayers' money. We are going to be speaking to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury very shortly. Let's just get reaction from our team of experts here in the studio. First of all, to Rishi Sunak. We've also got, luckily, the red books here with all the contents of the autumn budget and the Office for Budget Responsibility's Economic and Fiscal Outlook. Aren't we lucky? Everybody has been ploughing through them. What is your response, though, first of all, to Rishi Sunak?
Well, I was going to say, Joe, I mean, in a funny way, they're big, thick, heavy books for a big, thick, heavy budget that was about big spending, big taxes, the tax take to be as high as it's been since 1949. And Rishi Sunak, in a funny way, in that budget, someone just described to me, it was the something for everyone budget. You know, there was a bit for business here with some of the announcements I'm sure Simon will talk about. There was that bigger than expected tweak to universal credit, which the Chancellor says 2 million families will benefit from, a response to some of the concerns about the cost of living crisis. But also right at the very beginning of his speech, he highlighted something that is extremely important, that will colour the political atmosphere, potentially for many, many months, is that projection that inflation will hit 4%. And that is going to be a challenge for the government. It's going to be a challenge for everyone. But he's benefiting from the fact that it seems as if the pandemic did less permanent damage to the economy than we thought. But there's an awful lot of very expensive stuff he's promised to do in there, and he better hope that the numbers and those better projections are actually right.
Right. And in terms of the numbers, Faisal, because as Laura has been saying, there were lots of money for lots of things, some of it quite small, admittedly, and part of the budget was fragmented in terms of what he's actually giving to certain departments, for example. But overall, do the numbers stack up as far as you're concerned?
There are lots of moving parts in this budget, and I think probably there's a couple of facts just to sort of give you an overall picture. Borrowing in the final year, 24-25, is actually lower than it was planned to be pre-pandemic. So it shows, if you like, the shock factor from the pandemic kind of washes out. Now, that's not an accident. Part of that is the tax rise, but the forecast improvement washes through all of the borrowing numbers for the next 4 or 5 years. It lowers borrowing by about 35 billion. On top of that, you add in the extra tax, really significant tax rise. Just because we heard about it a month ago, it enters the budget in these numbers. That's another 15 billion. So there's about 50 billion a year of extra money deployed, and about 30 billion of that has gone on spending, and about 20 billion of that has been banked in terms of, these are very rough numbers, 20 billion has been banked in terms of lower borrowing. So you have lower borrowing, lower than we would have anticipated, frankly, given the shock that we have had. We have taxes as a share of GDP going up considerably, I think, to decade-old highs, and spending too. So higher than the highs we saw in March, going back to the Attlee government, the OBR is saying, and that is why you heard that very interesting peroration at the end from Rishi Sunak,
restating sort of
I am a Thatcherite essentially about 8 times,
yes.
But saying I don't like this, but I want to apologise for this. Really quite interesting sort of signal that he wants to change the picture over the next few years as regards this, because these are quite stark changes, and some sense in which is the state going to end up permanently bigger as a result of the changes that have been made from the pandemic, and what we discussed just before, which was, has the public appetite for intervention here? Is it a permanent shift? He says no. It's a temporary thing. I only did it for a couple of years.
Well, we will judge him, of course.
Tax cuts for the next election.
He did.
I mean, pretty much in black and white.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, obviously talking there to the Tory base and Tory MPs, promising people like Steve Baker we had on before that he will go back to some of the things that they would see as a true Conservative, free market, smaller state. On business, Simon, before the statement, before the budget, you were saying that business were feeling nervous, that business feel that the government hasn't been particularly warm and friendly towards them with some of the things that we talked about. Do you think that will have changed?
I think they weren't expecting a massive overhaul in business rates, but what they did get, I think the most eye-catching measure was a reduction in the business rates multiplier. That's a complicated mechanism, but basically it means ultimately that businesses will be paying £1 billion less a year over the next 5 years in business rates. Remember, it brings in 30 billion, so it's not a massive cut, but that's 5 billion. Another 1.7 billion cut by a 50% discount for hospitality for 1 year. Now, that will be celebrated, and they'll be toasting in the pubs of the UK because they've also been given a break on draft beer duty, so drinking on the premises. That will be very helpful. And also, alcohol will be reformed, so you'll basically tax the alcohol rather than the product. The stronger the drink, the more the tax. That, again, will help beer, and also some English wines. And there's also, they got rid of the super tax on sparkling wine, a champagne budget, you might say. But listen, this will really help the hospitality sector. One big disappointment was that target of £22 billion in research and development has been pushed back 2 years. And that was one of the things that business were fearing, and that fear was realised in this budget.
Let's welcome the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Simon Clarke. Hello to you.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for joining us. Let's talk about inflation, because as we were just discussing, that was certainly how Rishi Sunak opened, to some extent, his budget statement today. But if you remember, Simon, the Prime Minister said at party conference that rises in inflation would be temporary. The Chancellor just told us that the inflation is set to average 4% over the next year. So we're in for the long haul, aren't we?
Well, look, the inflation situation is obviously something which we monitor extremely closely in conjunction with the Bank of England. Inflation is expected to peak early next year and then decline. Obviously, the government is doing its bit to make sure that we address all of those pressures, and we've had a series of things to help with the cost of living announced today, obviously including things like the freeze to fuel duty, the freeze to alcohol duty, and the wider changes as well that we've introduced over recent months, like the Household Support Fund, which is designed to help the most vulnerable families.
But it's not temporary.
We're working on a global basis,
is it?
of course,
That's the point. It's a lot.
Well.
I take everything you're saying, but it's not temporary. The Prime Minister was wrong to say it was temporary, because temporary implied that it could be just till Christmas, maybe early in the new year, and that is not going to happen, is it?
Well, it's washing out through the system, and it is going to peak early next year and then return to trend. And I think we have to recognise, as the Chancellor alluded, that there are real pressures here in global supply chains which are making this problem worse. And as we take concerted action to address those, and we heard, for example, a series of measures around HGVs in the budget speech, these are things which are designed to make sure that we can ease those inflationary pressures and get back to normal. And the Bank of England does have a very strong mandate in this regard. That was reaffirmed by the Chancellor today, and that obviously is the focus of our work and the banks.
But at the same time, Simon, Rishi Sunak blamed global issues, global supply issues. Now, he may have written, as he normally does, to the Bank of England, but what are you expecting them to do about it?
Well, clearly some of these issues are global, and we are seeing that.
He said they were the main issues, in fact, driving it.
Well, I think we have to recognise that as the global economy is waking back up and demand is very robust, that is having some inflationary pressures, and we need to do our bit to try and control those aspects which touch on the UK. Now, we know, for example, there's a European-wide shortage of HGV drivers. That partly reflects COVID, it partly reflects the demographic of the workforce. What we can do in that space, for example, is to make sure we take the easements that we're doing around vehicle testing, around training and skills boot camps, to try and make sure that we get as many drivers as possible in place, get the flow of commerce going as quickly as we can, and tackle the pressures that way. You're absolutely right, Joe, that we don't control fully all of the impacts of global inflation, but we do have some powerful levers. There's a lot in the budget to address the cost of living. The Bank of England has got its mandate reaffirmed, and we're all conscious. We obviously want to see this, come back to normal.
How do higher wages help that? Because you've announced an end to the freeze on public sector pay. I mean, the Prime Minister is effectively encouraging people to ask their bosses for a pay rise in his high-wage, highly skilled economy. That will take a number of years. And if everyone follows the Prime Minister's advice, high inflation is here to stay.
No, but we want to see sensible pay increases. And what we're saying is that the public sector pay freeze, which was the product of the immediate challenge of the COVID expenditure, which, lest we forget, has cost us £400 billion, that can come to an end and a normal pay review body process can ensue, and we'll be in conversation with those pay review bodies through the course of the months ahead. When it comes to the national living wage, and obviously I'm really pleased that we are continuing with our progress towards two-thirds of median earnings by 2024. That is set independently by the Low Pay Commission. Their job is to consider both the needs of workers but also their wider responsibility to the economy and the round, and they obviously have to strike a right balance. We've endorsed their findings.
Simon, you probably know that here in the studio with me we have Laura Kuenssberg, Faisal Islam and Simon Jack. Faisal.
Yes, Chief Secretary, good afternoon. Can I just ask you, the OBR has just predicted, as we've been discussing, 4% inflation. The Prime Minister says he wants everybody to have a wage rise. Are you saying to the people of Britain, the workers of Britain, that they should go to their bosses and ask for a 4% pay rise and the Prime Minister backs them?
We're saying that we want to see a high-skill, high-wage economy, and obviously what we're looking at...
What does that mean in practice? Does that mean that they should get pay rises?
We're certainly not in the business of telling people, or indeed employers, what they ought to be doing. We're trying to set in place a series of things to boost productivity, boost skills, obviously make sure that we create the underlying growth which always makes pay rises affordable. But equally, what we're signalling is for those parts of the economy that we control directly, that the public sector pay freeze will end and that the national living wage will increase. And obviously also through the announced increased universal credit, that people who are low earners will get to keep more of what they work very hard for. That is, I think, the right balance for the government to strike. We obviously are focused on making sure, as I say, that the wider economy can grow quickly enough to make better pay affordable. And that is the mantra that we're going to be championing, not just today, but for the rest of the Parliament.
Is your general message that the inflation issue is still transitory? And if it is a problem, it's the Bank of England's problem?
We're certainly saying that we don't believe that this is going to worsen substantially and then persist at those levels. We think it will peak in the early months of 2022 and then returned to trend levels, that the Bank of England has the prime policy levers to address that, but that we will do our bit around supply chains and counter-inflationary measures around the cost of living to make sure that those pressures are eased as much as falls within our ability to do so.
Right. Laura?
Can I ask on a different issue, Chief Secretary? The budget's cutting air passenger duty and freezing fuel duty. Essentially, you're going to make it cheaper for people to fly and drive days before a major climate conference when the UK is trying to persuade other countries around the world to do more to tackle emissions. I mean, that's completely contradictory, isn't it?
No, we're very conscious, Laura, as you say, that obviously we've got a great record, the UK, in terms of our emissions reductions. And the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are both keenly aware of that, and indeed the Prime Minister was championing it at PMQs immediately prior to the budget speech. We want to make sure that the cost of living is controlled. That's why we've frozen fuel duty for the 12th year in a row, and I can't apologise for that. When it comes to air passenger duty, yes, we've cut APD within the UK, which is obviously a pro-union measure and also about helping to get people to get about more easily.
It's nakedly a political attempt to celebrate or underline the union between the four countries in the UK rather than something you're doing for a good economic reason. It's a union measure to make it cheaper to fly from London to Glasgow when you could get a train within 4 hours.
I think it's both. I think we should rightly celebrate the fact we are one United Kingdom. I think also we want to improve connectivity. I don't see a contradiction between that. It's also really worth stating that obviously long-haul flight, ultra-long-haul flight, will become more expensive as part of the package that the Chancellor has announced. And that, again, reflects our wider ability to both try and stir economic growth, but also to protect the environment. We shouldn't forget, just last week we had the 30 billion net zero strategy announced, and that sets out how we're going to decarbonise homes,
and this completely
transport,
contradicts
and
it. Isn't that
industry.
exactly the point? You're sending completely different messages.
No, we're working to strike the right balance, and the emissions that flow from vehicles and from airlines are as nothing compared to the wider decarbonisation set out in the strategy. Obviously, we also are looking to support the development of new technologies. So this budget and SR set out the plans for 2,500 zero-emission buses, for example. There's more funding for clean maritime, for clean cars. These are all things we all want to see, and we all recognise. We've banned the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles from 2030, and that will have an impact well ahead of that deadline. We all recognise we need to decarbonise, but we also want to make sure that in the meantime, families' bills don't increase beyond what they can bear. And I think people will think we've struck a sensible balance.
Just briefly, buried in the documents, although the Chancellor didn't seem too keen to talk about it, it's revealed in there that you're increasing the Council's precept for social care. In other words, ordinary council tax bill payers are going to be whacked again to cover the cost of social care. That's not at all what the Prime Minister and the Chancellor boasted about fixing social care, is it?
Well, we've always been clear that council tax remains a vehicle through which we pay for the cost of social care. It's a 2% rise in council tax and a 1% rise in the adult social care precept. That's actually the lowest increase in council tax bills since 2015-16, and again reflects our priority to make sure we help with the cost of living.
On local authorities.
But it's absolutely the case. There's also a very good settlement for local authorities. They're getting 1.6 billion additional in each year of this settlement. So we're giving a strong support to local government. We've obviously made the difficult choices around the health and social care levy, and we don't apologise for that. What we will not do, clearly, is increase spending on healthcare and social care and then whack it on borrowing, which I'm afraid is what Labour would have done. And it isn't a responsible approach to these things. We want to be upfront with the British public. Look, there are some tough choices around how we pay for these things, but what we will do, sticking closely to the fiscal rules which the Chancellor outlined, is make sure that we aren't borrowing for day-to-day spending. And I think that is such an important principle for us to uphold. Otherwise, we're simply passing the costs of healthcare today onto the children of tomorrow, and that simply can't be right.
Simon Jack here. Obviously, business still reeling from the fact that there was a whopping corporation tax rise earlier this year and then an increase in national insurance contributions for employers. What a lot of them told me on the way into this is that what they were worried about was that the government would backslide on some of its commitment on research and development spending. There was a target of 22 billion by 24-25. They said that would help crowd in a lot more private sector investment, which is exactly what Rishi Sunak said he wants to do. And this government has said that's the way forward to incentivise private sector to invest. You've delayed that target by 2 years. Why is that?
Well, it's simply about managing a profile of expenditure. We're still going to be at £20 billion by 24-25, which is a huge increase and represents 90% of the way to our target, which is going to be, as you say, now in 26, 27. But this is overall very pro-business package of measures. We obviously heard from the Chancellor about changes to R&D tax credits to try and incentivise not just more spending, but more spending within the UK. And we had the measures around business rates, which again are going to be hugely helpful to businesses up and down the country,
worth
making
about
sure
£1 billion
that they face lower costs over the course of the months ahead, and that we support in particular retail, leisure and hospitality as they rebound. So
I'm sure
this
that
all needs to be seen in the round, but our commitment to being a science superpower is absolutely undimmed. It's supported by tens of billions of pounds worth of investment, and it's something which we are very proud of.
So the business rates cut is about £1 billion a year out of a tax take of £30 billion a year. Is that right?
Well, business rates as a whole are worth £25 billion. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, the cut we've announced is worth £4.5 billion over the course of the Parliament. That is a very substantial offer to support the high street and to support those physical premises in their battle to remain competitive against online retail, and that's something which we're very closely committed to. There are new reliefs as well around investment in green projects or in your premises. What we're trying to do here is support responsible behaviour, and that's something which I think will be welcomed by a lot of businesses around the country.
Simon, it was very telling at the end of the statement, because of criticisms by Conservative MPs, that Rishi Sunak wanted to sort of restate his Thatcherite principles. He didn't like the size of the state. He was unhappy about it, but felt it was necessary for the time. But he also said during the budget, today's budget increases total departmental spending over this Parliament by £150 billion, the largest increase this century. He boasted about it. That could have been Gordon Brown at the dispatch box, couldn't it?
Well, we're rightly proud of the fact that we're not seeing a cut to any department. Every department is seeing a real terms increase over the course of this spending review, and that's to enable core projects, whether that be the 50,000 more nurses or the 20,000 more police, or tackling the backlog in our court system that resulted from COVID. These are all public priorities, and that's certainly what I hear from my constituents in Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland about being the lived reality that they want to see addressed. Now, we all recognise that COVID has had a major effect on our economy and our society. It's going to take time for that to recede. We do want, clearly, to get to a position where we can get to a world, as the Chancellor said, where we can offer tax cuts and we can look at the size of the state. But we do also have to see, we face a choice here as we recover from this pandemic, whether we retrench or whether we invest. There are huge opportunities to be unlocked, actually stronger and more equally distributed growth that we want to see happen. That levelling up theme of this budget and spending review is something that I'm personally very passionate about, and I know the Chancellor is too. And we are enabling that. It is a conscious choice, and it's not always an easy one. But we've also shown through our action on business rates and universal credit, we will bring the tax burden down when we can.
All right, when you can. We don't know when that'll be. Obviously, you hope it'll be before the next election, as Rishi Sunak was alluding to. But are you comfortable with the idea of presiding over the highest tax burden since 1949, and also this level of spending that is going to continue?
Well, I'm comfortable that the package of measures we've announced today balance these priorities. We obviously want to make sure that we recover strongly from COVID, that we support families with the cost of living, and that we invest in our public services. We are very mindful about how we pay for all of this, and we've got clear fiscal rules in place to make sure that debt is falling as a percentage of GDP and that we're not borrowing for day-to-day spending. We've shown that we value clearly the impact that tax cuts can have. We all want to reduce that tax burden over the course of the Parliament. The Chancellor explicitly said so in his speech, and I think over the course of future fiscal events we will see further moves in that direction. For now, we want to get the economy turbocharged. We want to support families up and down the country during the winter ahead so that we can in 2022 really throw off the shackles of this pandemic and get back to business.
All right, Simon Clarke, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, thank you very much for your time. We're going to talk to Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Just before I come to you, sorry, Paul, Laura, did you want to...
I just think it's very interesting. You see, Simon Clarke there is not somebody who would be a fan of sort of Brownian budgets, this sort of big spending. But, you know, one of his colleagues has literally just sort of messaged me saying, I see this landing as a great Labour budget, right? There is going to be anxiety on the Tory backbenches about the scale of all of this. But as we just heard Simon Clarke saying, they think in this moment, these are the right calls to make for now, carrying on with a sort of big spending ethos.
Right. It is, though, Faisal, back to the sort of point that you made, that does it chime with the public appetite?
Well, clearly, I think we've seen this pattern across this budget and spending review, is that there's kind of sprinkling bits and bobs. There's I talked about a booster jab for the economy. It wasn't that. It's kind of almost like microsurgery, trying to get productivity up, trying to solve specific problems with poverty after the universal credit fall and the rise in prices. So bitty, you'd expect that from such a 3-year review. But remains to be seen if it can fundamentally change productivity, as every Chancellor before has tried to do with these sorts of documents.
Paul Johnson has been waiting patiently. Let's get his expert take on this. Anything that really struck you? Because we talked earlier on, Paul, in the programme about a lot of the pre-announcements. We knew some of the spending. Now we have a complete or a more complete picture. What's your view?
Well, I think the really striking thing is the scale of the increases in spending, which have essentially been paid for by the very big tax rises that we found out about in the budget and back in September. And that spending has essentially covered all of government. So the Chancellor is truthfully able to say that every department will see increases. And, of course, he's found another couple of £1 billion to increase universal credit. I think what's really striking about taking this budget and the last one together, and remember this, in the first budget of this year, he raised taxes a lot because the OBR had some pretty miserable projections about the economy, and he felt he had to do that in order to protect the public finances. But as the OBR has increased and improved its projections, he hasn't undone those tax rises. What he's done instead is take the tax rises, not use them to reduce the deficit, but use them to increase public spending instead.
Now, the figures, the backdrop, again, we thought they were going to be slightly better than expected. Do you agree with that?
Well, the figures for unemployment are extremely positive. I mean, I don't think anyone projected such a tiny rise in unemployment after the pandemic, and the increase in growth over the next few years is a bit better than the OBR was expecting back in March. It's still actually less optimistic about the impact of the pandemic than the Bank of England was. There's also some quite interesting stuff in the OBR document saying that it still thinks, and particularly based on what's happened to trade over the last year, it still thinks that Brexit will reduce national income quite significantly as a result of reduced trade. So that's built into all of the figures. But the biggest worry in all of this is the 4% plus projection of inflation. And actually the OBR's projection doesn't even take account of the more recent increases in gas prices. So it could easily head up towards 5%. And again, you compare that with what they thought in March, and it's a very, very sharp change.
And that's because the backdrop of cost of living pressures that you have just been outlining against that 4%, average 4% of inflation, is going to make it very difficult, even with pay rises that we have discussed, whether it's increases in the national living wage or the freeze being lifted on public sector pay. A lot of that increase, whatever it is in terms of public sector pay, is going to be eaten away by inflation.
Yes, and if you again look in the documents, deep in the bowels of them, you'll see that the expectation for household income increases over the next 5 years is that it will be pretty stagnant, growing at less than 1% a year for the next 5 years. That's partly because of inflation, that's partly because of the big tax rises that we've seen imposed, it's partly because growth is so poor. And that's really very disappointing, because remember, we've had a decade of pretty stagnant living standards. And I think, in the end, I think that's going to be the big political driver of a lot that goes on, as it was over the last decade. Poor living standards had a big political effect, and it looks like that almost non-existent increase in living standards over the next half a decade. And that's a big blow to all households and families, of course, but it can also have a big impact on politics.
All right. Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, we have everybody here in the studio. You know them all. They'd like to put some questions to you as well.
So, Paul, it's Laura here. Just in terms of brass tacks then, as you were saying, despite these very chunky spending commitments, essentially our viewers and everybody watching and listening and trying to digest everything that's been announced today, most people are going to feel pretty hard up, that money's pretty tight for a long time yet.
I think in terms of household budgets, yes. I mean, I think everything's pointing in that direction, though, that the increase in inflation and the increases in taxes and what is still actually pretty poor growth, but all of those together, and people on average certainly aren't going to be laughing all the way to the bank. And one of the things I think is going to be striking, though, is that's going to be very different for different people. I mean, there clearly are bits of the economy where there are supply constraints, where there are shortages of obviously HGV drivers and so on, where we will see some big pay rises, but there are other bits of the economy where we won't see that. So there will certainly be some people, probably quite a significant number, who see their real living standards actually falling over the next couple of years.
Paul, it's Faisal here. Obviously you heard the Chancellor's kind of peroration at the end, promising tax cuts at some point in the future. The headroom seems quite small. It doesn't seem it's like preloaded. You can see the room for where he gets the money for some tax cuts. But do you think is that pre-baked in? Do you think the headroom's enough right now for them to almost guarantee that he could cut taxes?
Well, not at the moment. I mean, it was a slightly odd, given what he'd just done through the budget, which was to use his own tax rises of earlier in the year to pay for his own spending increases, to then say, well, I don't believe in tax rises and spending increases. Well, it didn't chime with the actual content of what he was saying. I mean, his room for manoeuvre, as ever, will be determined by what happens in the economy and in what direction the OBR forecasts go. He has got a little bit of headroom against his own fiscal rules, but in the context of looking 2 or 3 years out, it's a tiny, tiny amount of headroom. So he's only, I would say, got a 50-50 shot on the basis of what we know about the uncertainty of the public finances.
It's Simon Jack here, Paul. The government has always said it wants to be the best place to start to grow and manage a business. And yet businesses have felt pretty duffed up in the few months in the run-up to this, with the national insurance rise, with the corporation tax rise. We used to be quite a competitive tax regime. What do you make of the competitive position of the UK in business terms after this budget?
Well, of course, the corporation tax rise back in March was very big indeed. I mean, the Chancellor was right to say that it still leaves the headline rate relatively low by international standards, but we do also have quite a broad base. So the actual amount of corporation tax that companies pay is not particularly low. It's not particularly high, but it's certainly not particularly low now in the UK. There wasn't a great deal of additional change in this budget. There were some small, reasonably small changes to business rates, which will help particularly some smaller companies. I mean, as you said, the national insurance contributions will go up. Relative to our Western European competitors, our social insurance contributions do actually remain relatively low. But you also will see in the OBR document evidence of quite a big reduction in trade with the European Union. So the continued impact of the additional trade barriers that we have with the European Union is taking its toll on business as well.
Right. Can we talk about education? Because we haven't touched on it yet. And the government has been criticised, Paul, as you know, for not investing more up until this point in terms of catch-up. And in fact, they have refused to, for example, extend the school day, which was a recommendation from one of the education experts. Now, Rishi Sunak was lauding the fact that they are going to return per pupil spending to 2010 levels. But what is your general view on, of course, this important part of the Whitehall departments?
Well, returning spending to where it was in 2010 it's not an enormous amount to boast about. I mean, to have no growth over 15 years in such an important part of public services is, I mean, it's unprecedented. So it's hardly a bonanza in the education system. I mean, there is a bit more money in there for some elements of further education, which are clearly incredibly important, have been really dramatically starved of funds over the last several years. And I think in terms of schools, there's been so much good news about the impact of the pandemic in general. It hasn't, in general, hit younger people in the end more than older people. It hasn't actually even particularly hit lower paid people more than better paid people in the end. But it has really hit less well-off children, and much more than it has better off children. So I think spending additional money well to fix that particular increase in inequality, I would have thought would be one of the biggest priorities of the government. I'm afraid I haven't yet had enough time to look at the details of this to see how much is being devoted to that, but clearly an awful lot less than the education recovery czar Kevin Collins was proposing earlier in the year.
And Paul, it's Laura, do you see a sort of pattern there in a way? I mean, there are quite a few different areas that I heard where Rishi Sunak was sort of boasting about almost putting wrong things that happened between 2010 and 2016, that sort of period where there was a real pullback in terms of government spending after the credit crunch under George Osborne. That it seemed to be he was sort of undoing a lot of things that the Conservative governments, successive Conservative governments have done. Is that a fair characterisation?
Well, he's certainly done that on the tax side. I mean, remember how much effort the previous governments put into reducing corporation tax and increasing the income tax personal allowance and so on. And in his last budget, he completely undid that. On spending, I mean, it does remain the case, of course, that spending in a lot of the areas he was giving extra money to will remain below where it was in 2010. I think there is, though, as you say, certainly a repair job that's being done here. I don't think there was anyone who disagreed that the justice system, for example, or the further education system or the social care system needed more money. And that was, I think that's really in particular about undoing some of the damage that was done in the later part of that prior period. So not so much the initial cuts, but once you got to 2014, 2015 and the cuts kept on coming, that's when a lot of these services really started to struggle. And I think what we'll end up with is a world in which some of those effectively some of those later cuts are undone to undo some of the big problems that were created then. But this was certainly, this was a very, very different budget to the kinds that George Osborne used to present.
Laura Gordon-Brown budget?
Well, in many ways, yes. I mean, both in terms of its length, in terms of the number of things that were announced, but also actually in terms of the scale of spending increases that we're looking at, much more like Gordon Brown than George Osborne, for sure.
And in terms of Gordon...
He'll really love that
He will. Well, we've made it twice now on his behalf. Before we let you go, Paul, I must ask you about universal credit, because obviously there's been a long-running campaign by many MPs to reverse the decision to take away that £20 increase, temporary, as the government was saying. This announcement today of cutting the universal credit taper to 55% from 63%, will that compensate?
Well, for some people it will, and for some people it won't. So certainly if you're in work full-time and on universal credit, then you'll get the full benefit of that reduction in the taper, and it varies according to how much you're earning and how many children you have and so on. So certainly for some people in that position, yes, they will benefit, some considerably more than £1,000. Taking the Chancellor's words at face value, on average by about that much. Of course, if you're out of work or not earning very much, then you won't. If you're out of work, you won't benefit from this at all. And remember, it's actually childless people out of work whose benefit has been most. All governments have been most mean to them. It hasn't risen in 50 years,
right,
which is an astonishing fact, and that clearly won't compensate that group. So some people, yes, some people not at all, and some people a little bit.
Paul Johnson from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to take you through some of the key headlines from the budget before we talk to the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Bridget Phillipson, in Central Lobby in the Palace of Westminster. So the Office for Budget Responsibility expects inflation will hit 4% and it will average at that level for next year. Growth expectation has been revised up from earlier in the year from 4 to 6.5% this year. That was to some extent expected that it would be revised up. Also, one of the main headlines is that every government department, as you've been hearing, to get real terms rise in spending each year. Paul Johnson himself saying he has been slightly surprised by the levels of the increase. Universal credit taper rate, as we were talking about, reduced from 63 pence to 55 pence. That obviously a big subject for discussion in terms of claimant benefits. And the foreign aid spending to return to 0.7% of GDP before the end of the Parliament. You will remember that the government said it was reducing that on a temporary basis and would return it when the fiscal basis allowed it. It now will be before, says Rishi Sunak, the end of the Parliament. Business-wise, 50% business rates discount for hospitality, retail and leisure for 1 year. You heard Simon Jack saying that will be quite a big boost, at least for 12 months anyway, even if business rates aren't being scrapped. Simplification of alcohol duties, that was also trailed with stronger drinks paying more. It will be the strength of the alcohol in terms of attracting the higher duties. Planned rise in fuel duty scrapped. Again, I think it's going to stay that way in perpetuity, it seems like. I think it's the 12th or the 13th consecutive year, but it is not going to go up. And £11.5 billion for up to 180,000 new affordable homes. Now, there was quite a lot of detail when it came to housing. There was also, I think, about £5 billion in terms of removing dangerous cladding. An extra £4.7 billion for schools budget by 2024 to 2025. Faisal, I know you have to go fairly shortly, and if you don't, that's even better. But just your thoughts generally listening to what Paul Johnson was saying.
You can see that, I mean, the big picture is that taxation that came in has been kept when, you could have chosen, given some of the pressures on cost of living, actually, you could have chosen maybe to return some of that, but it's instead been spent. And those potential for tax cuts been rolled forward for 2 or 3 years' time. But it does jar with his end kind of conclusion that I definitely do want to cut taxes. I definitely do want to cut taxes when, the forecast that underpinned the need to raise taxes in March, well, a lot of that forecast has gone away now. The economy's looking like it's rebounded more strongly, unemployment is lower. He's choosing to top up these spending totals. He's choosing to do some targeted help as regards the cost of living crisis. Clearly, what was unexpected, the economy has done better than it was 6 months ago, but clearly this inflation problem, they are very alive to. They want it to get out.
I think that was the thing, the thing that stalked this economy and this budget, whether you're an individual, a business or the government, is inflation. And that is one of that bogeyman out there which no one can quite control, no one knows quite, and that will drive everything in the next year or two about how living standards change, how businesses invest, how prices
Although the pressure on the Bank of England, and as we know, one of the levers for the Bank of England would be to increase interest rates.
Quite an odd signal right at the beginning of the speech when he said, I have reinforced, I've told the Bank of England to get on the case. Not
me, the Gov.
Let's talk to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. I should say the Shadow Chief Secretary. I promoted you there very quickly, Bridget Phillipson, you noticed. You've been listening to some of the conversation, Bridget. Unemployment is lower than expected. The state of the public finances are looking healthier. It's good news, isn't it?
Well, there are welcome measures in the budget, as there would be in any budget. So on the taper rate, that was the right thing to do, for example. We've been calling for that for a long time. Although, of course, it still means that lots of people on universal credit will still be facing a higher marginal tax rate than the Prime Minister himself. I think it felt more generally a budget that was out of step with the pressures that a lot of families are facing right now. So there weren't any immediate steps around, say, gas and electricity bills. We've been calling for the Chancellor to cut VAT for the next 6 months to make life easier for families as those bills drop onto doormats. Also, whilst any support for business is to be welcomed, we haven't seen that fundamental reform for business rates that I know that businesses are really crying out for.
Right, but one of the things the Chancellor had announced already and confirmed is that the national living wage will rise to £10.50 an hour by 2024. Now, as you'll remember, there was a huge row at the Labour Party conference when Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, wouldn't budge beyond pledging £10 an hour. The government have overtaken you on this.
Well, we're committed to a higher rate of the national minimum wage than the government are, but we also think there should be wider support within the economy to help families through what's been a really difficult time and is likely to continue with all of the pressures around food prices and fuel and gas and electricity bills. I mean, the difference, of course, in the Labour Party is that we like to discuss how we can raise people's living standards, and in the Conservative Party it feels like they want to have a discussion about how they make life harder for people, because actually, coming out of this budget, working people are still facing the biggest tax burden they've ever faced in peacetime.
Right. I mean, if you listen, though, to some of the money that has been pledged by the Chancellor today, we heard from the Labour Mayor in Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham. He's been on the airwaves praising the extra money announced for transport networks across England. Do you agree with him? The government have got it right.
No one's going to turn down money for local projects or for the local area, of course they won't. But whether that rises to the scale of the challenge that we face in the longer run is, I think, a much bigger question. I mean, we also heard from the Chancellor today that by the end of the Parliament, growth's only going to be 1.3%, which, to be honest, is absolutely terrible. And yet, at the same time, he's pulling money out of research and development funding, pushing that further into the distance, when we know that actually making our economy more competitive, more productive, will do a lot to drive growth. And the government's record on that is pretty dismal. You know, in terms of some of the spending announcements, you know, say schools, for example, the government are taking us back to where we started 11 years ago, you know, which strikes me as completely unnecessary to have proceeded in that way in the first place, because of course we've, you know, damaged the wider economy with some of those changes, but also we've made it more difficult for children and young people to thrive, which in the long run, you know, does have a big knock-on effect on the economy as well. And that catch-up plan that we needed for our children, that the government's own Education Commissioner wanted to see, well, there wasn't much there on that either.
How much are you pledging to spend on education?
We'd said that we believed that a catch-up fund of £13 billion should be committed, and we set out how we would pay for that. Because actually, if you look at much of the independent research that's out there, the damage around not taking action will be far more severe in the long run. And the same is true on climate change as well, which is why we've got a much more ambitious plan, both to tackle climate change, but also to create lots of really well-paid, high-skilled jobs across our country. And the cost of inaction will far outstrip the cost of acting now, and the Office of Budget Responsibility have been really clear on that too.
But Bridget, it's Laura here. I mean, you said in various different areas, as you've outlined, Labour would want to spend more. But this budget has also put the tax burden to the highest it's been since 1949. So if Labour was in charge in government, the tax burden would be higher even than it's been for that number of decades. You'd be relaxed about that?
That's not our position, I'm afraid. We're committed to a much more fair tax system reform across the board. We need a modern tax system that's fit for the 21st century. That's part of the reason we've been arguing for changes around business rates. And obviously central to this is to get our economy growing again. If we're only getting to 1.3% by the end of the Parliament, that's going to make it more difficult. That lost decade of growth has meant that we've had less to invest in our public services, and it was completely unnecessary to have gone ahead in that way. We take taxpayers' money incredibly seriously. People work hard, they want good value for money in terms of what is spent. Unlike the government, however, who allocated £37 billion to a test and trace system that didn't actually deliver, and we heard today from the public.
But Bridget, for our viewers, just to be clear on that point, though, that you've outlined you want additional spending in lots of different areas, but if you were in government, you would not want the overall amount of tax that is taken into the Treasury's coffers to go up.
I'm not going to set out for you our general election manifesto, but what I will say...
That's a point of principle, though, isn't it?
Well, we've set out very clear priorities as to how we would raise money differently and where we would put that. So there are lots of examples. For, you know, take closing the charitable status of private schools. That would raise £1.7 billion that we could then put into giving all of our children and young people the best possible start in life, not just those who happen to go to private schools. So as with all of these things, it's a question of priorities and choices. And we would be making different choices right now with a different set of priorities, putting ourselves on the side of working people and making sure that we're taking action to address those very immediate pressures that they face, but also putting the economy on a much stronger and more resilient footing for the long run too.
Faisal?
Hi, Bridget. Faisal Islam here. Just in terms of the universal credit, the £20, I mean, clearly you want that to be reinstated. Do you recognise that when that was put in place, it was always said it was going to be for the most acute part of the pandemic for the year? If it had been designed to last forever, for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, it wouldn't have been £20, it would have been £5 or £10.
I think that's quite a difficult argument to make to those who've depended on it, is the honest answer, because if you're someone who is facing rising fuel and food bills, if you're worried about how you're going to put food on the table and look after your children this winter with a winter coat, I'm not sure you'd be too concerned as to whether it was temporary or whether it was going to be permanent. And of course, for a lot of families that only started needing to claim universal credit during the pandemic, for a lot of them it's all they've ever known. And it was the wrong choice for the government to pull that away. Of course, it's right that they make changes within the universal credit system overall. There are further changes that need to be made. We think it should be replaced with a different system entirely.
All right. Bridget, you were talking about making different priorities. The Labour government would do that. Is this a priority that you would be in favour of? 5 projects across Teesside, where your constituency is going to get 100 million, more than £100 million from the Levelling Up Fund. Is that a good priority?
I always want to see more money coming to the north east of England and to my constituency, and I've backed projects that would allow that to happen. All I'd say is that we need a much bigger change within our economy and society if we're really to see growth and jobs coming back to our shores. So, you know, money, I will never say no to extra funding,
but
it
have
doesn't
accused
address
the government of pork barrel politics in its determination of which areas get funding, but clearly not in this particular instance.
Well, we'll be looking very carefully at where this money's going, because the government have got a pretty terrible track record in how they choose to allocate funding. But of course, as a constituency MP, I want the best for my constituents, and I want to see more money coming to the north east. But does this address some of those wider challenges around how much money people have got to spend in local shops and in local services? Does it really address those longer term challenges that we've seen where it comes to delivery of local services, which have massively been cut back over the last 10 years? No, it doesn't. So, you know, I'll never say no to any money, but does it address all the problems we face? I'm afraid it doesn't.
And Bridget, your colleague Rachel Reeves had a last-minute scramble to do the budget response after Keir Starmer tested positive for COVID. We understand it only happened about 20 minutes before Prime Minister's questions. You work closely with Rachel. How do you think she did? Should Keir Starmer be a bit worried about how strong her performance was?
I thought Rachel was fantastic. She is completely unflappable, and even when presented with that at the last minute, did a fantastic job, notwithstanding a lot of the Tory boo boys trying to give her a really hard time, and she really held her own. I thought it was a fantastic speech.
Bridget Phillipson, thank you very much for joining us, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Let's speak to Alison Thewliss, Shadow Treasury Spokesperson for the SNP. Welcome to you. Let's talk about some of the allocations of spending as well. Rishi Sunak said this budget would mean £4.6 billion extra each year for Scotland, the largest block grant since 1998. Do you welcome the additional funding?
Of course I would welcome additional funding for Scotland, but the devil will be in the detail with this, as it always is with this Chancellor and with this government.
On the basis of?
On the basis of all the things that they've done and said in government, you have to look at the real detail of what's in there, and we haven't got the full information on that as of yet. And of course you would expect the devolution settlement money to go up year on year, because that's the nature of public spending. And I will await the detail of that before I congratulate them too much on something they should be doing anyway.
Now, you're against the removal of the universal credit uplift or increase. Will the Scottish Government pay to keep it for Scottish families in receipt of universal credit?
Well, this is a problem created by the UK government, and they should reverse
but the Scottish Government could make a priority of it for Scottish families in receipt of universal credit.
Well, the Scottish Government's already paying additional money to individuals and to families through the devolved social security payments that we have. So, for example, we have the Scottish Child Payment, which is putting extra money in families' pockets in Scotland right now. The difficulty is that you have the Chancellor taking that same money back out of people's pockets, both through the universal credit reduction and national insurance increase. So I think it's for the UK government to fix the problems that they have created, and I'm hugely disappointed to see that they haven't taken the opportunity to reinstate this uplift, because it has made the difference for my constituents.
But the answer, to be clear, Alison Thewliss, is a no. The Scottish Government isn't going to make that a priority. You could compensate that yourselves.
Well, I'm sure my colleagues in the Scottish Government will look to see what is possible from the devolution settlement that we get and what options are available to us. But I maintain the position very much so that this is the UK government's problem, and it will affect people right across the UK, this cut. And it has been the difference in my constituency between people going to food banks and people having enough money to put food on the table. And with the winter coming, with the increase in fuel bills that we're seeing, it's a really difficult situation for very many people. And Rishi Sunak didn't acknowledge that at all.
Just ahead of the climate summit in Glasgow, Rishi Sunak announced that air passenger duty on flights within the UK, domestic flights, will be reduced. It'll be lower. That'll help airports in Scotland. Do you welcome that?
Well, I think it does really beg our belief that they're looking to reduce air passenger duty on internal flights within the UK. it really sends out the wrong message entirely around climate change when we've got the world coming to our doorsteps in the coming days. And I think he also didn't realise that Inverness Airport doesn't pay air passenger duty anyway. He wasn't well enough informed about how air passenger duty actually works in Scotland at the moment. Right. And I think it is a real missed opportunity in this budget to talk about climate change more widely, because there's a huge amount of investment the Chancellor could have been putting in,
wasn't this a policy of the SNP government to do exactly that, reduce air passenger duty by 50%?
Yes, and we acknowledge the climate change issues of that and changed our position on that accordingly. And I think that was the correct thing to do.
Isn't that slightly contradictory, Alison?
I'm sorry?
Isn't that slightly contradictory?
I think we need to acknowledge that there are particular issues of geography that affect Scotland. So, for example, flights to and from the islands, which are lifeline services for the people that depend upon those. There's a real difference between that and flights between Edinburgh and Manchester and things like that, for example. Those are really very different. If there are viable public transport options to be taken, that's where the funding should be going to, rather than cutting taxes and internal flights.
All right, Alison Thewliss, thank you very much. Alison Thewliss there from the SNP. Well, here in the studio, we have been joined magically by Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Welcome to you. We've been discussing at some length the better than expected figures on a whole range of economic indicators. Unemployment not nearly as high as expected. Borrowing is lower. There's been more money being spent on Whitehall departments. What was not to like from your perspective?
Well, because they had more money, I was really surprised they failed to invest in our schools. Liberal Democrats had argued for an emergency budget for children. As we heard from Paul Johnson from the IFS, they really didn't step up to the plate with that challenge. And after the COVID pandemic, there are lots of young people, teenagers, whose mental health has been hit, and there's been big inequality issues. A lot of the evidence suggests that children from more disadvantaged backgrounds have been hit the most. So that's why Liberal Democrats had argued for more money. And guess what? We've started looking at the details. They're giving more in a tax cut for banks in the City of London, tax cut for banks, and they've announced today for education catch-up funding. That is the wrong priority. You're right, when you've got a lot of money, it's about priorities. This government, the Conservatives, have chosen the banks above our children. That's wrong.
Right. In terms of priorities, though, you will have also heard Rishi Sunak say that he was returning the per-pupil spending to 2010. That was before you, as part of the coalition government, of course, cut it.
Well, we didn't, actually. It was cut from 2015. During the 2010-15, we maintained in real terms education spending, and Liberal Democrats made sure more money went to disadvantaged children through the pupil premium. The cuts happened mainly after 2015. And as Paul Johnson from the IFS said, the idea we're getting back to the same rate in 2010, over 20 years later, is not a sign of success. Again, it's Conservatives choosing the wrong priorities. Liberal Democrats...
They would, of course, argue we've had a pandemic to come through, and they've put an awful lot of the departmental spending in health, which you would agree with.
But you've rightly said they had a lot more money because growth was higher. This was the moment to invest in our future, in the children, in our schools. I think there'll be millions of parents out there who are pretty upset by that. And then you could come to carers. You know, I've been talking as Liberal Democrat leader a lot about the need to support unpaid carers, the ones who've probably been hit most by the pandemic, who are looking after family loved ones. There's nothing. Literally nothing in this budget for carers, for those unpaid carers. And so, you know, whether it's carers or children, I'd have thought they'd be a priority. They're certainly Liberal Democrat priorities.
All right.
They don't appear to be the government.
Right. The priorities, of course, billions of extra for the NHS, an increase to the national living wage and the national minimum wage. Those are things that you will vote for.
Well, we've argued for them. So I'm delighted that at long last they're actually putting those into practice. But even some of the smoke and mirrors we saw from the Chancellor, if you look at the case of a single mother working part-time on the minimum wage, she's going to lose out from the universal credit changes announced before the budget and in the budget. So let us be clear, there's a lot of low-paid workers who aren't going to get help. Remember, there's the increase in national insurance going to hit unemployed workers. There's the freeze in the income tax allowance, which will hit low-paid workers. Yeah. Liberal Democrats argued and actually implemented a big increase in the tax-free allowance and took millions of low-paid people out of the tax altogether. The government haven't done that.
Right, let's talk about local councils, because there was an extra £4.8 billion for local councils. The Liberal Democrats lead 49 councils overall. That will be welcome, won't it?
Yeah, we've got to look at the detail, as all these things...
Well, Davey, one could say you're just not satisfied with anything.
Well, I'm certainly not satisfied with what they've done for children and schools. I'm really not satisfied with what they're doing for unpaid carers, and I'm not satisfied with what they've done on climate. Let me tell you where I'm satisfied. Let me give you some cheer. I'm really pleased with what they've done for pubs. Community pubs is something that Liberal Democrats have campaigned long and hard over many, many years, and belatedly they're actually doing the right thing for community pubs. So really happy with that. But you know, my constituents who've got kids, my constituents who are caring for loved ones at home, and my constituents who are worried about climate change, they'll actually, when the detail of this budget comes out, they'll be pretty disappointed.
Stay with us just for a moment. I'm just going to show everybody this tweet. Simon, it'd be good to get your response. It's from the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry. Tony Danker, whilst firms will welcome today's measures, we remain in a high-tax, low-productivity economy with concerns about inflation, the things that we've talked about. This budget missed the opportunity to redress those challenges with a major focus on investment and growth. So that is the first sort of major response we've had from one part of the business community.
I think there was a couple of disappointments. One was the £22 billion target for research and development by 24-25. That was pushed back by 2 years. That was seen as important as crowding in private sector investment. The other one was the failure to do the major overhaul of business rates. That's been asked for a long, long time. I think it's been put in the box, which is too hard to deal with right now. And you did get a £1 billion a year because they've reduced the multiplier, which basically reduced business rates. And as Ed Davey was just saying, there's a 50% business rates cut for hospitality, leisure and others next year, and I think that will be a welcome boost. But the opportunity to try and have this mass overhaul, root and branch overhaul of business rates, they feel is missed. But there was an extension of the 1 million capital allowance, so there will be some R&D spending going in there. And the government would point out that although we didn't hit the £22 billion mark, we'll be £20 billion by 24-25, which begs the question, was it worth missing what a lot of people saw as an important target for £3 billion? And he spent an awful long time detailing booze changes, and there was £3 billion worth of duty cut on basically the stronger the drink you drink, whatever. And Davey said that will help pubs for sure. A lot of people will be disappointed they missed that R&D when basically the rhetoric has been making the UK a scientific powerhouse.
Right, in the remaining minutes, let's talk about the politics, Laura, because you could argue, the government certainly would, argue that they answered some of the big criticisms, whether it was on universal credit, whether it was on wages, it tried to counter some of the criticisms about rising inflation. But where does it leave the government, particularly this restating by Rishi Sunak at the end, that this isn't really where he wants to be? He wants to be somewhere really quite different.
Well, that's right. And there was almost a sort of sense at the end from Rishi Sunak that almost sort of dangling with saying, well, he made me do it. You know, Boris Johnson's sitting there as I'm not suggesting that that is what happened here. But Rishi Sunak was at pains to make it clear that from an ideological point of view, he would much rather be in a different environment. Now, yes, you can say, of course, nobody would be wanting to try to rebuild after a pandemic, after the last couple of years that the country has been through. But it is representative, I think, of this tension inside the Conservative Party, that this is, and forgive me for saying this again, this is a high tax, big spending Conservative government, and it's going to stay that way for the foreseeable future. And also the benefit that families and firms might feel from that might not be very great. And we were hearing from Paul Johnson, actually, it might not feel very great at all. Things may continue to feel very tough and perhaps even feel tougher for lots of people who are watching and listening today. And therefore, that is a political dilemma. This isn't a sort of budget where you chucked around loads of money, loads of tax was raised, and as a consequence, everyone's going to be feeling good and cracking open the bottles of cheaper Prosecco.
Yes.
It's a big budget, big spending, high taxes, and not quite clear whether the government are going to benefit politically from what they've said.
Well, or whether their own side will be the ones who are criticising them. That is all we have time for. Thank you to you, Ed Davey, for joining us in the closing moments of this programme. Thank you to all of my guests for joining us today. It was a big day with the budget and the spending review. I'll be back tomorrow, though, at 12:15. Bye-bye.